Chapter 595. End of Volume 6, Summary and Some Words. Please read it for free. First, I want to express my gratitude to everyone for using the votes in your hands to kick me to third place. This is the most intense month since the start of the new book month. I've been in the top 3 before, but not as nervous and excited as I was yesterday. Perhaps only when people start to want something will they start to value a certain goal. I let out a long sigh. I reached my goal last month completely because of everyone's support. I'm really grateful. 7,949 votes. That was a record in the year of Qingyu. It was doubled in May, but it was still only around 8,000 votes. It was really difficult for me to imagine that I would be able to get so many votes. Perhaps it was because I was getting votes more frequently and being more shameless. Perhaps my frequent canvassing for votes would make some of my dear readers feel a little unhappy. I apologize in advance, but it can't be helped. In Jianghu, people can't help themselves. Just like the little girl on the bridge, she stretched out her hand out of habit. Handsome, buy your girlfriend a flower. Everyone is handsome, so I have to reach out my hand for votes. I have to admit, the ranking on the monthly votes is related to the prize money, but not only is it related to the prize money. There is also a sense of satisfaction and vanity from being recognized, and I am indeed very vain. This is not an excuse. Speed and passion are like this. A fat man can only burn fat, but not the universe. I can only say my thanks again and promise to write more seriously in the future. After saying my thanks, I got to the main topic of the day. After solving the 3rd volume, I have to write an epilogue for every volume. It can be considered a summary and chat with everyone about the content of the volume. This was announced to everyone the day before yesterday, so please take some time to read it. Volume 6 is the longest volume, with a total of almost 1,000,000 words. It can really be described as vast and endless, long-winded, like the eldest princess foot-binding. It was clear that the 6th volume was the most important volume of the Qingyu year. Because in this volume, all the traps buried in the previous volumes had been stripped of their disguises, and all the power they had accumulated exploded. The people hidden in the dark had all jumped to the front of the stage, and those who were alive or playing minor roles had all died. In the first chapter, before Wu Zhou's son-in-law, when I finished the 2 songs, I was very excited. I wanted to shout, "Something big is going to happen." There were at least tens of thousands of people who had died in this scroll. If only those with names were counted, there were still quite a few. It was truly a tragic scene. Ever since I started writing, I had never written about so many deaths. In the Vermilion Bird Chronicles, Yi Tianqing's massacre of the heavenly soldiers always gave people the impression that he was waving light dots around. Of course, that didn't count. Many people had died, and we had to arrange different ways of death for them. We had to make sure that their deaths matched their personalities. It was a very painful thing, and I was very tired from writing. Particularly for the commoners who had died unjustly, they could not be easily explained away. Dead people also needed to be respected, particularly people like Ku He and the eldest princess. As for the ingenuity and pitfalls, it was not tiring to fill them in, because this was the content that had already been prepared when the 1st volume of the Qingyu year began. Speaking up to this point, I would like to explain a little. This is because a small number of readers think that the emperor transforming into a grandmaster is a cheat, and that the transformation is too sudden. There are even more unkind comments that say that I am too lazy to write an outline, so I write whatever I want, and when I see that things can't be solved, I let the emperor transform into a human. I scratched my head. No, I really did write an outline, and I wrote a detailed outline, haha. Perhaps there was a problem with my ability, but there was no problem with my attitude in writing the Qingyu year. I carefully thought through each step before I continued. It was just like the emperor's true nature, the arrangements of these few years, and even a dozen years. In reality, before the riddle was revealed at Dong Mountain, even as early as half a year ago, there were already readers who had guessed that the emperor was a great grandmaster. They had basically caught all of the threads I had hidden. It was a happy thing for a storyteller to hide something in the story and then be caught by a friend who was reading the book. For example, the Qing Emperor's discovery of Lin Wan'er's movements in the Qing temple before Gong Dian. For example, after a night of poetry, Wu Zhu and Fan Xian entered the palace. For example, the emperor's strange behavior in the royal study. For example, the source of his powerful confidence. For example, the play in the Hanging Temple. For example, how he knew of the eldest princess and the crown prince's secret and thus proved Fan Xian and Pingping's evil plan. I was very satisfied that, regardless of whether it was the Qing Emperor or Yi Luyun, these two biggest traps, they had already pointed out what they were hiding the first time they appeared. The Qing Emperor's first appearance was in the Qing Temple. Yi Luyun's first appearance was in Danzhou and he saw Wu Zhu. The world was so big. Why did he go to Danzhou? It had been a long time since I had been narcissistic. Today, I would be a little narcissistic. I was very satisfied with these two threads leading to the end. As for the Qing Emperor's identity as a great grandmaster, the deepest hidden thread was mentioned in Chen Pingping and Fan Jian's last conversation. During the northern expedition, the Qing Emperor was heavily injured. His entire body was stiff and unable to move. I have mentioned this story many times before. The more important ones were in Volume 4, Chapter 28, and Volume 5, Chapter 50, Autumn Forest, Whispers. At the time, Chen Pingping faintly said to Fan Xian, at the time, the emperor was injured. His body was as hard as a block of wood. He could not move at all. As for the matters of wiping his body and urinating and defecating, there had to be a careful woman left to do it. Later, on a stormy night, the eldest princess also mentioned her brother's heavy injury. His entire body was stiff. What did that look like? It was actually the exact same situation after Fan Xian's tyrannical Jinqi reached its peak and exploded. During that northern expedition, the emperor, who had already trained his tyrannical Jinqi to the peak, fought a bloody battle and spat out Jinqi wildly. Just like the battle between Fan Xian and the shadow, he finally exploded. Furthermore, he exploded even more fiercely than Fan Xian. He did not have two circulations like Fan Xian or Fan Xian's monstrously thick meridians. His luck was even worse than Fan Xian's. In the barren mountains and unruly rivers, there was no doctor, no medicine, no waste, and no begonia. There was only Chen Pingping and Lady Ning. Thus, the Qing Emperor's meridians were shattered. He could not move at all. He bled internally and almost died. However, in the end, he survived. Without great perseverance and great luck, one could not reach the realm of a great grandmaster. When it came to perseverance, without question, the Qing kingdom's mighty emperor fully deserved to be number one. No one could compare to him. As for the story of that northern expedition, how the emperor entered the realm of a great grandmaster, and the effect this experience had on him, there will be a more detailed description in the next volume, Emperor of the Dynasty. I will not continue here. Since we are talking about the Qing Emperor, I will say a few more words. Perhaps from the beginning, I knew what kind of ruthless character I was writing about, so I have always secretly invested my feelings in him. Even now, I still think this emperor is very remarkable. When a person is cold-blooded and heartless, or a bastard, you have to admit that this is another form of greatness. Furthermore, we always stand in Fan Xian's or Yi Qingmei's point of view to consider problems. Sometimes, perhaps we forget that the Qing Emperor also made many sacrifices for the sake of a goal. In other words, he was also an idealist. Among the people of that generation, there were three idealists. One was Yi Qingmei, the other was the emperor, and the son of the two of them was a true realist. He was a little merciful, a little lenient, a little scheming, a small citizen, a villager, and a cynic. Of course, this is what I like about Fan Xian. After all, he is still like a person, while his parents are not like people anymore. Book friends often say that there are two lines in the Qing Yu years, one in the light and one in the dark. One is about Fan Xian, and one is about Yi Qingmei. In reality, when I write, there are basically 3 lines. There is still one line that I have always kept in mind, and that is the Emperor. From this, it can be seen how much I value and admire this person. Admiration does not mean that I like him. My sisters, please understand this and promise me. When a woman reaches the pinnacle, she is Yi Qingmei. When a man reaches the pinnacle, he is the Qing Emperor. These are just some of my personal thoughts. They are not necessarily correct. Furthermore, I have always thought that when things are too extreme, they are always very cruel, cruel to others and to oneself. Fan Xian is so good, so mediocre. So, right now, he is so troublesome and difficult to endure. Things like feelings are always obtained through interaction. There are no innate feelings. For example, his feelings for Fan Jian and his feelings for Chen Pingping. Just as Gij Pig said, in front of the cave in Shi Mountain in northern Qi, Fan Xian mainly thought of Yi Qingmei as a distant and unreachable kindred, a friend connected by blood and heart, close but unfamiliar. However, her legacy lived on. Every breath of air carried the scent of that woman. Everyone beside him would retell the story of the past. Gradually, Fan Xian finally determined his own nature. He was already in the Qing kingdom. He was a part of this world. Yi Qingmei was his mother. This was the process of brainwashing. Fan Xian kept his distance from the emperor, but he had to admit that the emperor treated him well. Knowing favors was a good moral character. He could only blame himself, an orphan, for having such a pair of parents after his rebirth. But Fan Xian had also improved, a great improvement. It was an improvement in his worldview. This was a very remarkable thing. In terms of age, he was already a middle-aged man, yet he was still able to continuously revise his ideals. Particularly, his ideals had been washed away by death and appeared incomparably stubborn and ruthless. In the meadow, he stood up. In life, he should also stand up. He should gradually understand that life will always end. Some existences in life may be more important than life itself. Many people died in this volume. It is truly a sad thing, but I won't write anything to mourn those pitiful people because it is already written in the book. A few days ago, I saw a blog. The girl who wrote the blog, it should be a girl, right, wrote a long review after Dong Mountain. At the time, I remembered it. Later, I saw people transfer it in the book review section. Thank you very much. In a moment, I will move it to the public area for everyone to take a look. I sighed again. Writing this volume was very tiring, particularly the last dozens of chapters. It was truly beyond my expectations that I had written so many words in August. Sometimes, I found that some sour words were right. After writing for a long time, it was no longer me who controlled the story, but the story that controlled me. The people in the story had their own thoughts and were not controlled by me at all. Then, they had the desire to act and speak, and they used my hand to beat it out. That is why I wrote so quickly last month. It was because of this that I couldn't resist writing one paragraph after another. Perhaps it was because I had feelings for the characters in the story. Fan Xian had stayed in that world for a long time, so he had love. I had written about this world for a long time, so I also had love. Regardless of whether it was Vermilion Bird's story or Qing Yunyan, the latter parts were better written than the former. For the work of the 7th volume, I had taken the time these 2 days to read Qing Yunyan in detail from beginning to end and once again confirmed this point. It wasn't because I didn't put in effort at the beginning. It was because the characters at the beginning were all unfamiliar and distant to me. After writing 2 million words, I was already very familiar with these people's faces. Like the little girls selling noodles downstairs, I was happy and naturally familiar with them. The level of the later parts was better, but the level of the words did not improve. Especially after rereading, I found many wordy places, sticky places, and redundant words. This was a very shameful thing. My words were sloppy, but they were never clean. The cleanest words in Qing Yunyan still appeared in the chapter where Fan Xian killed the assassin when he was 12. The problem was that I had written that chapter for 4 whole hours, and the number of words was still very small. For the time being, I can't solve the problems with the words. Please forgive me. However, I still liked the chapter names I chose. Every afternoon after writing a few thousand words, would worry about what to name it. Basically, it was all nonsense, but sometimes it was quite interesting. In the last 10 or so chapters, many readers pointed out that there were many famous foreign names. Some friends even asked in the book review section if I had been studying the history of foreign literature. Actually, what you said was right. The process of writing Vermilion Bird's story was a learning process. Until the end, I was still full of energy and my mind was full. Writing Qing Yunyan was a digging process. My mind was almost empty, so I decided to read. I wanted to read the world's famous books to fill my empty mind. Unfortunately, I still didn't manage to read a single book. I only sadly remembered many of the titles I found, such as The Grapes of Wrath, Father and Son, The Winter of Our Discontent, 100 Years of Solitude, and The Catcher in the Rye Field. Hey, you don't say. The names of these famous books really matched the contents of the chapters. What a coincidence, it seemed my luck was similar to Fan Xian's. Although I couldn't read famous books to improve myself, stealing so many names helped. If I wasn't reading famous books, what was I reading? Of course, novels from Qidian. I read a lot of novels. You can see on the rankings, I basically read them because I like to read. This was the starting point of my writing. Yes, it was time for the book recommendation at the end of each paper. Of course, I won't talk about the old books, because everyone on earth knows about them. I'll just talk about the books I liked in the past few days. The first book is called The Ordinary Life. This is my favorite in the past half a year. Warning, it's a book for girls. Don't read it unless you like it. But I want to strongly recommend it to everyone. It's not just light, not just the irrepressible mockery at the beginning, not just the detailed descriptions, the key is the portrayal of the characters, the fluency of the writing, and the most alluring fantasies at the bottom of the words. Shunning is the most suitable character to be a daughter. That's why Fan Xian named his daughter Shunning, because I hoped that Xiaohua would be like Shunning. Wan Ning is the best character I've described in the books I've read in Qidian. Who does she resemble? Like Dingya, Li Shiming, Shi Xiongzi, Li Xiaoning, these seniors in the long river of history. In Qidian novels, there are very few characters that make you like. I can't say it, but it's good. And I always thought that the boy that the author wanted to make fun of at the beginning, didn't die. That's what I firmly believe. My friend especially Bai insists that Shunning is the best match for CC, and he went to make a lot of noise. But I think that unless this CC isn't the CC, then we should just forget about it. Coincidentally, the second book I recommend is my friend especially Bai's new book. He's written about Shaolin monks and evil Ming. Now he's writing about the fist Qi. He always goes the hard route, and it makes people like me feel a bit of pain. I want to read about love and ambiguity, these urban things, but he wants men to go to this extent. The fist Qi should be published today. This story is really hard. If everyone wants to read something straightforward, then read this book and train your spirit. The third book I recommend is Chaotic Clouds, student Chui Hua's new work. The quality is guaranteed. Chui Hua is Ning Chuiya. That guy is finally back. Yes, of course, this book has very few words. If I recommend it, it will certainly attract discussion. But I have to admit that I've been reading this book since the beginning. I've been reading it all the way until the end of his draft. Of course, the draft is more than just the words posted now. If I remember correctly, Chaotic Clouds should have been written more than half a year ago. In the end, it took so long for it to be posted. Xiao Chui put in a lot of effort. She put in so much effort that it took her a lot of effort to write. It was truly admirable. I need to read it carefully. After talking about the 6th volume and recommending books, I will talk about the 7th volume, which is the final volume of the Qing dynasty. This volume is very troublesome, very troublesome. I will try to finish it before the end of the year and draw a satisfactory full stop. I don't need to worry about a bad ending because cats care about their tails the most. Cat owners all know this. The 7th volume, Emperor of the Qing dynasty, has 3 periods. Of course, it is still the traditional way. It is impossible to suddenly and inexplicably start. However, there are some things that started in the 8th year of the Qing calendar that I cannot talk about specifically. Everyone, please follow me as I unfold it. The joy in front of the palace is not joyous. As for Emperor of the Qing dynasty, perhaps it looks a bit depressed, but I want to twist it into a bright youth. Everyone, look at how happy I am writing this summary. You will know what kind of emotions I am cultivating. However, because the 7th volume is too troublesome, I need time to organize my thoughts and outline. I ask for a day off from everyone so that my mind, which was empty because of the end of the 6th volume, can be taught again. Today, other than this summary, there is no main text. I ask for everyone's understanding. However, I have written over 5,000 words in the summary. I really am as long-winded as ever. It is very strange that I did not update on the first day of the month, but I cannot help but urge everyone to vote for me. It is said that it is easy to go from frugality to extravagance, but difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. It is difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. It is difficult to go from the vast ocean to the water. Apart from Mount Wu, it is not clouds. Taking a flower bush, I am lazy to look back. Half fate, the monthly vote, and half fate, I raise my cup to invite the bright moon. I do not want to be scolded, so I quickly stop being sour. Finally, I congratulate teacher Wang Haidong for having children. Mother and daughter are safe. As a mother, her stomach was stabbed, but as a father, his feet hurt. This is a small matter. I congratulate him again. Yes, it is about the same time as Fan Xian's father. Chapter 596. A dream of glory and splendor, half a piece of scholarly papers, 1,000 feet of sea waves. Horse hooves shatter the frost of the forbidden street, listening to the rooster sing several times. Dust and clothing, the heart of the Jianhu. Out of the royal phoenix net, Mui Qi Shouyang, sighing that Han Peng did not end. Early in the paper, the demonic form. Yuan Wang, Yuan Heng, the emperor of the court, as the inscription, the clouds in the sky were like wet cotton, ready to squeeze out water at any moment. They were also like large lead ingots, heavy and not something the air could hold. They were probably going to smash into the world in the next moment. Rain was already trickling down from the leaden clouds and dripping to the ground. No one knew when it would become a torrential rain. Song Shiren, once the best litigation master in Jingdo and nicknamed Rich Mouth, now had white hair at his temples. His features were no longer as free and at ease as before. He was much more steady. He gazed calmly at the sky. No one knew what he was thinking. A moment later, he pulled back his gaze and sat in a chair, feeling a bit tired. Beside him, someone had brought him hot tea. He took a sip and rinsed his mouth. He then accepted a scalding hot towel and pressed it against his eyes. Only then did he feel more energetic. There were also people behind him massaging his back and legs. There were also people who began to fan him. However, the autumn of the 9th year of the Qing calendar was already cold. Additionally, the autumn rain was about to arrive. Jingdo was completely cold. How could he stand the fan? Song Shiren couldn't help but shiver. The person beside him in black official robes glared at the subordinate holding the fan. This Overwatch Council official was the head of the First Bureau, Mu Tai. He looked carefully at Song Shiren and said, "Sir Song, are you confident?" Although Song Shiren had heard this title for a year and a half, he was still not used to it. His brows furrowed and he calmly replied, "Don't worry, sir." This litigation master's first official appearance was in the 4th year of the Qing calendar on behalf of Minister Guo's family. He sued the son of the assistant minister, Song Shiren, for fighting underground in the middle of the night. That case was also a rare complete defeat for Song Shiren. However, he truly caused a stir in the Qing court because of the property dispute lawsuit involving the Jiangnan Ming family in the 6th year of the Qing calendar. In that case, relying on the Overwatch Council Commissioner Fan Xian's strong support, Song Shiren spent half a year in the Suzhou government. He demonstrated everything he had learned in his life to the fullest. He forcefully grasped the loopholes in the Qing law and Ministry of Justice's rules and completely defeated the natural inheritance right of the legitimate eldest that was deeply imprinted in the hearts of the people. This Ming family property dispute lawsuit was truly in Jiangnan, aimed at the Jingdou royal palace. It had to be said, later, the emperor's worship to the heavens to depose the crown prince, as well as the crown prince's final forced rebellion, all had an unclear connection to this lawsuit. In Jiangnan, Song Shiren's glory was limitless. However, when he returned to Jingdou, the crown prince had not been deposed and the empress dowager was furious. The old woman had only quietly said a few words, and the world's best attorney had been kneaded into an ant by the palace. His family's property had been confiscated, and he had to see the world look down on him. He set up a stall in Lotus Pond Square and struggled to survive. Fortunately, Fan Xian returned to the capital at that time and secretly sent him out of Jingdou. He also gifted him a large sum of money as a form of repayment. At the beginning of the 8th year of the Qing calendar, the Jingdou matter was settled. Fan Xian brought Song Shiren's family back and bought him a manor in the west of the city. At the same time, he gave him the identity of an official. Although the best attorney in the world could earn money, his status was not as high as an official's. Song Shiren was endlessly grateful. At the same time, he knew he had to sell his life well for Sir Fan Jr. Additionally, after experiencing the baptism of these few years, Song Shiren was no longer as arrogant as before. Instead, he appeared steady and ordinary, but he still had a powerful ability to execute laws. His present identity was an official of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council's legal department. He was responsible for helping the Overwatch Council fight lawsuits. The Overwatch Council also needed to fight lawsuits. If this matter had to be told from the beginning, it would be a very long story. There were two important points. First, a few years ago, the Emperor had taken back all of the Overwatch Council's trial power and divided it between the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court. Thus, the Overwatch Council was now more of a public prosecutor. During these 2 years, the little Duke of the Overwatch Council seemed to have been provoked by something. After asking for the Emperor's edict, he began to purge the governance of officials. The Overwatch Council had captured countless corrupt officials in various roads, counties, and departments. If they captured a criminal official, they had to be interrogated. If they were just handed over to the Ministry of Justice and Supreme Court to interrogate, the Overwatch Council would not be satisfied. Sir Fan Jr. would also not agree. Everyone knew that officials protected each other. Since the Overwatch Council wanted to investigate the governance of officials, they would not give these civil officials a chance to band together. Thus, Song Shiren, the newly promoted official of the Overwatch Council specializing in lawsuits, played a great role. As long as he appeared, the crimes the Overwatch Council pinned down were basically all brought to fruition. No matter how the court civil official system tried to hide it, they were unable to let the criminal officials escape. What truly chilled the Overwatch Council were the Emperor's edicts after the Jingdou matter was settled. Although these edicts only continued the plans set when the 7 gentlemen entered the palace and had the Imperial Censorate enter the Council's internal procedures to carry out supervision, the Imperial Censor of the left, He Zongwei, relied on the Emperor's favor and clear edicts to truly use his power. On one hand, he weakened the Overwatch Council's power. On the other hand, he began to attack some of the Overwatch Council's violations of the law. The world was large, but it was not as large as the Emperor's edict. After almost 2 years, the Imperial Censorate's power gradually grew. It was like a rope across the Overwatch Council's neck, making it difficult for the Overwatch Council officials to breathe. He Zhongwei was like a hunting dog, standing guard outside the Overwatch Council. As long as an official of the Overwatch Council did something forbidden, he would not be soft-hearted or courteous. He would draft up a rule and send it directly to the Supreme Court to ask the court to punish them. The Overwatch Council didn't have any good ideas. From the beginning of the Overwatch Council's establishment, there had been this rule. The Qing law had strictly restricted them from acting against the Imperial Censorate. However, because of the powerful existences of Chen Pingping and Fan Xian, this rule had always been forgotten, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Now that the Emperor had once again remembered this matter, the Imperial Censorate began to shine. Fortunately, Sir Fan Jr. was still the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, so the Imperial Censorate's actions were still relatively gentle. He Zhongwei was careful not to touch Fan Xian's bottom line. He only made an issue of the Qing law and didn't bring any insult to the Overwatch Council. However, the Overwatch Council acted in secret and would often violate the Qing law. The Imperial Censorate relied on edicts to urge the Supreme Court to investigate. Even Fan Xian didn't have a good way to deal with it. In the end, this was the Emperor's edict. Furthermore, he knew that the Overwatch Council's dominance was not a good thing for the court. Understanding did not mean accepting. One day in the 8th year of the Qing calendar, Fan Xian kicked open the main door of the Imperial Censorate. He pointed at the 20 or so Imperial censors under He Zhongwei and cursed them angrily. He then invited Song Shiren back. Wasn't it just a lawsuit? Was the Overwatch Council afraid of others? Song Shiren had to fight 2 lawsuits in a row in the Supreme Court. One was that the Overwatch Council had found that a vice-director of the Ministry of Works had colluded with the River Transport Governor's Yamen to embezzle silver from the river works. Furthermore, this silver was not from the public. Fan Xian had painstakingly saved it from his own little treasury in the Jiangnan Palace treasury. Then, through the Hangzhou conference that Lady Fan controlled, it had been transported to the River Transport Governor's Yamen. Greed had reached the head of the Overwatch Council's ancestor, so the Overwatch Council was not polite at all. They didn't care about the minister-councilor's connections in court or the private pleading letter the River Transport Governor had sent. In one dark night, they arrested 20 related criminals and locked them up in the 7th Bureau's prison for a few days before sending them to the Supreme Court. The second lawsuit was a bit of a headache. The Imperial Censorate had found that a certain official of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council stationed in Nanzhou had secretly transferred some silver from the Honglu Temple. When this official returned to the capital to report on his work, the problem was discovered. Using the words of this 4th Bureau official, at the time, there was not enough funds. In order to develop spies in Nanzhou, they had no choice but to use public funds. However, no one knew exactly how much he had used and whether or not he had intercepted it. The inside of the Overwatch Council knew that this colleague had certainly received benefits. It was just that he was a spy in a foreign country. Even though Commissioner Fan had consecutively increased the Overwatch Council's monthly salary 3 times, they were still nervous. No one was a saint. Has the case been prepared? Song Shiren glanced at the assistant beside him. His name was Chen Buchang. He was the famous person who had fought against Song Shiren in Jiangnan. Unexpectedly, in the end, he had also been half invited and half tied back to Jingdou by Song Shiren. The newly established legal department of the 8th Bureau was all famous litigation masters from various places. Every time he thought of this, Song Shiren, whose heart was as calm as still water, couldn't help but smile bitterly. Sir Fan Jr.'s way of doing things was still as arrogant as ever. It was clear that the Emperor had the Imperial Censorate check and balance the Overwatch Council, yet you still brazenly went against them and did it so happily. Chen Buchang made a sound of acknowledgement and stood up. As an official of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council, Mu Tai was listening at the side in the Supreme Court. He wanted to see how the Vice-Chancellor of the Ministry of Works was treated and to ensure that the official of the Fourth Bureau of the Overwatch Council would not suffer too much. All of the officials of the Overwatch Council admired the Eighth Bureau's legal department because they knew that these former litigation masters were the greatest protection for their interests. He patted Song Shuren's shoulder and sincerely said, "Good luck, sir." Outside the Supreme Court, the rain gradually fell lightly. Song Shuren took a sip of tea. His face was full of confidence. With his hands behind his back, he walked toward the yamen of the Supreme Court. He walked steadily, completely disregarding the Ministry of Justice and Imperial Censorate inside. He walked confidently and confidently. The Jingdo commoners watching the spectacle across the street cheered in unison. They all hoped that the Overwatch Council would be able to chop down all of those corrupt officials. It had to be said that during these 2 years, the Overwatch Council's power had been greatly reduced, but its reputation had improved greatly. Fan Xian had used a few years of time to finally pull the Overwatch Council out of the darkness a little. Using a series of thunderous purges, he had established a glorious image among the people. Presently, the direction of discussion among the people was basically biased toward the Overwatch Council and felt disdain toward the Imperial Censorate. Song Shuren walked toward the Supreme Court. His expression was calm, but his heart was not. Working for Sir Fan Jr. was indeed delightful. Not only was it delightful to win, but he could also receive the support of many people. This was not easy. In over a year, Song Shuren had helped the Overwatch Council fight cases and had never lost. This time, it would certainly be the same. However, he had already completely offended the entire Qing civil official system. He knew that he could no longer get off the Overwatch Council ship. Once he did, he would be swallowed by a giant wave. However, he was not afraid because the person at the helm of the Overwatch Council ship was Sir Fan Jr. As long as Sir Fan Jr. was here, no one in the world would dare to harm him. There are some problems on the Nanzhao side. The Imperial Censorate and Ministry of Justice have taken a large amount of silver from that official's home. Chen Buchang looked at his expression and carefully reminded him. Return the stolen goods, remove from office, not guilty. Song Shuren didn't turn his head. Lowering his voice, he said, "This is the Commissioner's bottom line. If the Imperial Censorate wants to go further, they will have to fight openly. They will start with the Xin tribe. Not many of those people are clean." Chen Buchang's heart chilled. He thought to himself that Sir Fan Jr. was indeed like old Director Chen, a powerful and protective person. Looking at his meaning, if the Imperial Censorate did not accept Fan Jr.'s 3 conditions, Sir Fan Jr. was prepared to mess around. He couldn't help but shiver. With Sir Fan Jr. doing things like this, it was no wonder the Imperial Censorate could never win the case against his family. After all, no matter how much Sir He Zongwei was favored by the Emperor or how much effort he put in, he could not stop Sir Fan Jr. from becoming hostile at any moment. If Sir Fan Jr. truly became hostile, He Zongwei would not be able to withstand it. Given his personality, even if the Emperor spoke, it would probably be useless. Everyone knew how much the Emperor valued or favored him. Why didn't the Commissioner come to watch the show today? Chen Buchang swallowed and asked as he walked. During this year, Fan Xian's greatest interest seemed to be acting as a backer for his subordinates, listening to the Supreme Court's trials, and watching the Imperial Censorate's ashen faces. Logically speaking, it was fine to send an official of Mu Tai's level to listen. Even Yan Bingyun couldn't be bothered to come. Yet, he kept coming. This little duke sat with his legs crossed in the Supreme Court yamen. All of the trial officials began to feel afraid. No one dared to use torture on an Overwatch Council official. This was the effect he wanted. The Emperor has sent him out. Song Shuren only vaguely knew some inside information. he didn't say anything more. Rubbing his wrist, he glanced at the Imperial Censorate and Ministry of Justice officials in the hall. His face darkened. With a cold huff, he began to fight. Heading west from Jingdo, going around the verdant Song Mountain, crossing a number of clear rivers, and after a dozen more days, entering an area where hundreds of li of military land was being cultivated. This was one of the Qing Kingdom's 7 main roads, Xiliang Road. This road was the poorest place in the Qing Kingdom, but it was also the place with the strangest scenery. Most of the land along this road had been repeatedly fought over by the Central Plain and the Hu people over hundreds of years. Until the Wei Kingdom weakened, the Qing Kingdom and its predecessor, the vassal state, began to rise in secret. This country had not yet advanced into the heart of the land when they began to demand 1,000 years of blood debt and land from the Hu people. After fighting for many years and many people died, this piece of land was finally firmly controlled by the Qing Kingdom. At the same time, they built a number of new cities on it and moved in many people. However, it was, after all, a newly prosperous land. Other than farming, commerce was not developed. There were also no valuable products. It was only in recent years that the fleeing of the people who moved in had improved slightly. There were only flat and rarely tended fields, endless lines on the horizon, and the protruding mounds at the edge of the line. The barren desert in the distance looked desolate. The sun here set later than anywhere else in the land. The blood-red dusk enveloped the vast land and reflected a majestic city. It was completely piled up from earth and stone. It suddenly appeared at the edge of the land, flaunting the Qing Kingdom's powerful national and military power and intimidating the people on the grasslands further west of the majestic city. This was Dingzhou, an important city on the western frontier. The road from Jingdo to Dingzhou was maintained very well. It could accommodate 8 horses traveling side by side. Back then, who knew how much manpower and wealth had been expended? However, it ensured the eternal peace of the Qing Kingdom's west and firmly controlled this large piece of land. No matter how one looked at it, it was worth it. A group of carriages sped toward Dingzhou on this road. It seemed that they wanted to enter Dingzhou before the sun set. However, looking at the mountain in front of them ran the horse to death, particularly on this piece of flat land. Dingzhou seemed to be in front of them but was far away on the horizon. It looked like they would not be able to enter the city before the city gates closed. About 20 li from Dingzhou was a courier station. This courier station was not a military courier station. It was not under the jurisdiction of the Dingzhou army. Rather, it was a courier station managed by the Ministry of Works. Thus, it appeared a bit run-down and old. 7 or 8 men were yawning under the light of the setting sun. They had already eaten dinner and were preparing to gamble later. The sky gradually darkened. A strange smile suddenly appeared on the men's faces. They moved closer to the rear courtyard and listened to the sounds coming from inside. They covered their mouths and laughed, thinking that the person inside was too impatient. In a stone room in the backyard, the only official of the relay station was hugging a woman's snow-white thighs. His hands were pressed against her soft breasts, and he was moaning non-stop. His body was covered in sweat, and the room was filled with the smell of lust. Dingzhou was far away and did not have much entertainment. Night came too late. Thus, each time the sun set, he would seize the moment and carry out this only form of entertainment. The woman beneath him was a prostitute he had brought from Dingzhou. Although the prostitutes who were willing to leave the city were all average in appearance, he liked this woman's charm and the soft flesh on her body. Holding the slippery courier in his hand, he was incomparably happy. He felt that the woman beneath him seemed to be made of cotton candy, particularly her eyes, which were sweeter and more greasy than the well water in Dingzhou. The 3 liang of silver he earned a month was truly worth it. Just as he was enjoying himself, the door to the room was suddenly pushed open. The courier didn't even turn his head as he cursed, "If you want to listen, then listen. If you want to see, then look. F***ck, why didn't you tell me to be careful? How dare you barge into the door? Be careful not to make me sick on horseback. The prostitute beneath him also giggled. She was not at all afraid of being seen. Suddenly, the courier felt that something was strange because there was no sound behind him for a long time. He unconsciously turned his head and saw it was a stranger. Startled, he quickly jumped up from the kong and fastened his pants. He did not forget to pull over the black quilt and cover the prostitute's white lower body on the kong. The courier wanted to let loose a torrent of curses, but seeing this stranger's expensive attire, he was probably someone he couldn't afford to offend or an official. His mouth became dry and he became afraid. In a trembling voice, he said, "Who are you?" Fan Xian sat in the only chair in the courier station and looked at the large group of people kneeling in front of him. Furrowing his brows, he said, "I told you to get up, so get up quickly." He had come to Dingzhou on the emperor's edict to reward the army. He said it was to reward the army, but the secret edict he had received in the royal study had some other content. During these 2 years, the Hu people in the West seemed to have taken some stimulant or tranquilizer. They changed their romantic battle tactics of the past and began to attack Dingzhou in an organized fashion. Furthermore, their battle tactics had become very cunning. Although the Yi family still managed Dingzhou's military affairs, Yi Zhong was in charge of the Bureau of Military Affairs. He had to manage all the armies under heaven, so he could not personally keep watch. Additionally, the Hu people's attacks were too fierce. In the first year, the situation in Dingzhou was very dangerous. Fortunately, the emperor personally moved the soldiers from the various roads to take turns to provide support. Only then did the situation stabilize. The emperor and Fan Xian had long seen that there were problems, but without first-hand information, no one knew what was happening within the Hu people. The situation could not continue like this. If Shi Hu continued to develop like this, it would probably become a great threat to the Qing kingdom. Thus, Fan Xian had made this trip. He had to listen to the personal reports from the generals in Dingzhou and understand the situation. Furthermore, Fan Xian knew that the emperor had personally moved the 5 roads to the west with the intention of using the Hu people's knives to sharpen the Qing kingdom's swords. The Hu people's attack just happened to give the Qing kingdom a chance to train its military power and prepare for the war to unify the world in the future. Since he couldn't make it to Dingzhou, he could only rest for the night in this dilapidated relay station. Unexpectedly, no one came to welcome him when he entered. 7 or 8 men were eavesdropping like children. Fan Xian was curious and pushed open the door to enter. Unexpectedly, he saw a live erotic scene. The deputy and the 7 or 8 men knelt on the ground and repeatedly kowtowed. The officials who had come with Fan Xian knew his personality and had long pretended to see it. They each prepared to rest for the night. Fan Xian looked at the deputy and laughingly scolded, "The sun hasn't even set and you're already doing it. If you have the guts, then don't be afraid." The deputy's face fell. He knew he was about to be killed. The man in front of him was the second most important person in the world, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. He was a high and lofty figure. He was someone he didn't even have the right to see. Fan Xian asked with confusion, "What are you afraid of?" "Sir abhors evil and hates corrupt officials the most." The deputy was so scared he was about to cry. Paralyzed on the ground, he spoke of the people's impression of Fan Xian. Fan Xian rubbed the back of his head in confusion. He thought to himself that he was already the father of 2 children. Why was it that in the hearts of the people, he seemed more and more like an otherworldly saint or demon? Chapter 597. The sky was still beginning to brighten when the group of people from Jingdou rose and washed up. This time, Fan Xian had brought all of the council's people. Other than Mu Feng, who was now in charge of the Qinian unit's matters, the rest of the people were made up of members of the 2nd and 6th bureaus. The semi-military management of the Overwatch Council made these people's auras steady and taciturn. There was only the sound of water and the creaking of the door opening, but there was no conversation. It was nearly 20 li from the courier station to Dingzhou. Speeding along the 8-horse-wide road, it didn't take much time. Furthermore, they didn't need to cherish the horses. When this group of people arrived at the east gate of Dingzhou, the sun had not risen very high. There was a glimmer of coldness in the warmth. However, the vegetable farmers lining up to enter the city, as well as the merchant groups from the central plains, had already formed a long line. Autumn had not yet deepened in Jingdou, but the soldiers of the large city on the border had already begun to put on armor padded with layers of cotton. Fan Xian glanced at them inconspicuously and then indicated for Mu Feng, to prepare the documents for customs. From the beginning of his trip to Dingzhou, Fan Xian had not prepared to reveal the imperial envoy's honor guard. Of course, there were only a dozen people. Even if he wanted to, he couldn't. This group of people disguised themselves as Jiangnan merchants. In their hands, they held travel passes and tea contracts issued by the Ministry of Revenue and the Palace Treasury Transport Company. The reason they had to disguise themselves like this was not because the court had any suspicions about the inside of Dingzhou. Rather, it was because Fan Xian wanted to meet someone in private. In order to ensure that person's safety, it was best not to go through the court's channels and meet in private. After all, the Hu people had suddenly become enlightened. The emperor and Fan Xian both suspected that there was a capable person in charge in Shihu. Who knew if there were spies planted by the Hu people in the military and political manners of Dingzhou? The soldiers at the east gate did their inspection work very meticulously. Fan Xian did not line up. He stood to the side of the line and watched with cold eyes. He quietly nodded his head. The Yi family had operated on the western frontier for decades, yet they had not slacked off at all. No wonder the emperor appreciated them so much. The deputy at the courier station wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and followed behind Fan Xian. His heart was pounding. He had also changed into merchant clothing. His face had been tampered with by the Overwatch Council officials, making him appear even more wretched. However, he didn't understand why the noble in front of him would bring him into the city and why he had to dress like this. The line quickly reached Fan Xian's group. Fan Xian noticed that although the Dingzhou soldiers were strict in their inspection, they did not take the opportunity to collect any benefits. Furthermore, they did not purposely make things difficult for the merchants and farmers from all over. Their speed was very fast. Mu Feng handed over the customs documents, travel passes, and tea deeds that he had prepared. The official stilled slightly and furrowed his brows. He seemed to find something strange. Fan Xian watched from the side with narrowed eyes. He didn't know what had gone wrong, but he didn't panic. In any case, in the afternoon, he was going to the governor's manor in Shiliang Road to reveal his identity. There shouldn't be any misunderstandings between the two sides. The official's surprise was not because there was something wrong with the documents. Rather, it was because they were too beautiful, particularly the seals and signatures. They were all from the heads of the yamens. Thus, it meant that the identities of this group of merchants were very important. Otherwise, why would the old officials in court personally inspect these documents? Fan Xian and his group had not expected that they would attract other people's attention. It was very simple for the Overwatch Council to make these documents. However, the Imperial Censorate had been keeping an eye on them recently, so they had simply gone to the various yamens to find the real thing. However, if it was too real, it would be too eye-catching. If it was still Wang Qinian responsible for all the details around Fan Xian, presumably he would not make such a mistake. The official glared coldly at Mu Feng, and then unconsciously glanced at Fan Xian. He understood that this noble and beautiful young man was the true leader of this group of merchants. Fan Xian did not look back at him. He was looking with interest at the Dingzhou city walls in front of him. He wondered to himself, Dingzhou is surrounded by plains or wasteland. Where did these large rocks come from? Is there yellow soil stuck between the rocks? Can this be used to build city walls? The official furrowed his brows. Unconsciously, he did not want to provoke this arrogant young man. He nodded and let them pass. After the group of merchants entered the city, he called over a subordinate and said a few words in a low voice. Fan Xian didn't know that his appreciation of the city walls would give the Dingzhou soldiers the impression that they were arrogant. He truly liked to use his own eyes to see everything in this world. After all, it was a rare second life. He always had a strong desire to explore the beauty, history, and existence around him. He had seen Shangjing's centuries-old city walls and was very familiar with Jingdou's heavily guarded city walls. It was rare for him to come to the westernmost city of the kingdom, Dingzhou, so he was curious. Furthermore, he still felt some regret in his heart. He didn't know when he would have the opportunity to see the legendary largest city in the world, Dongyi. The deputy, who had followed him into the city with a long face, gradually understood why the Duke of Donbua had brought a minor character like him into the city. The Duke was preparing to go shopping. The streets in Dingzhou were a mess with all kinds of streets intersecting. Without a local leading the way, there were many nameless places that would be impossible to find. What gave him a headache was that it seemed to be the first time the Duke of Donbua had come to such a remote place, yet he was interested in everything. He wandered everywhere and did not find it tiring. In particular, the Hu people's weapons that had been shipped from the Hu people's tribes by Shiqi River attracted his attention for a long time. In about half a day, Fan Xian and his group had strolled through the Dingzhou trading market area. They had perfectly carried out the enthusiasm a merchant group should have. Under a mud wall, Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the distant city gate tower of Dingzhou. Lowering his voice, he asked, "Has the news been sent out?" Mu Feng'er carefully looked around and nodded. According to the agreement between the two sides, it has already been sent out. However, we came 2 days early. I'm afraid the other party hasn't entered the city yet. Fan Xian thought for a bit and said, "We had to come 2 days early. There's no way to block the news of me leaving the capital. Hongqing must know I'm coming. If I'm delayed by this kid, he will certainly force me to drink. How would I have time to do anything? Besides, who knows if there are Hu spies in the camp and the governor's manor?" Mu Feng'er glanced at the nervous deputy at the back of the group and said, "If I wasn't unfamiliar with the terrain, I really wouldn't have called for this person to lead the way. I don't know how to handle it in a bit." Fan Xian smiled and said, "It's not like it's a beheading. We just have to ensure the other party's safety. That's why we have to be so careful. As for the deputy, when we leave another day, we'll just send him 2 beauties." Although he said this, Fan Xian still felt some regret. The emperor had long forbidden the Overwatch Council from extending their tentacles too deeply into the military. Regardless of whether it was the 4th Bureau, which was in charge of the various roads, or the 2nd Bureau, which was in charge of gathering intelligence, the Overwatch Council did not have any capable people in Dingzhou. Of course, the Overwatch Council had certainly buried spies in Dingzhou. Fan Xian thought that the inside of Dingzhou was very safe, so he did not want to use these spies in case the military and political yamen were unhappy afterward. The ones who would suffer would be the lower-level officials of the Overwatch Council. The group of people stopped the carriage in a shady place and silently waited for the sun to slowly move. For lunch, they casually bought some sesame seed cakes and ate them with water. Fan Xian was no exception. Each time he moved, his actions always made the Overwatch Council subordinates feel closer. However, when the deputy saw the little duke also struggling to eat the sesame seed cake, he secretly sighed in amazement. When the shadow of the mud wall behind the carriage gradually grew longer, one of Fan Xian's subordinates returned humming a little tune. In his hands, he was still carrying the special Hu products he had bought along the way. It looked like he had been very careful along the way. At the back of the carriage, he threw these items back into the carriage and lowered his voice to say something to Fan Xian. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at Mu Feng'er. With a smile, he said, "Looks like they're more anxious than us. Let's go see them." Mu Feng'er thought for a bit. This shouldn't be a trap. After all, Dingzhou was the Qing Kingdom's world. No one would have the guts to set up a trap for the Overwatch Council. He nodded and went to call for the deputy. Leaving the carriages, Fan Xian, Mu Feng'er, and the deputy passed through the mud wall and through the bustling streets. They walked through the curious streets like merchants coming from the mainland for the first time. After walking for an indeterminable amount of time, they finally arrived at a lamb shop. Fan Xian looked at the shop without a signboard and couldn't resist smiling. Damn, this place is really hard to find. He patted the deputy's shoulder. Looks like you're not bad. You even know these places. The deputy felt his entire body go limp. He thought to himself that this shoulder had been patted by the Duke. It looked like he couldn't bear to bathe for half a month. No, he only bathed once a month. It should be because he didn't look for a woman for half a month. Not looking for a woman did not seem to be worth it. Just as the deputy's thoughts were running wild, Mu Feng'er had already walked into the lamb shop. Turning his body sideways, he walked through the inner door of the mud room. Covering his nose, he walked into the inner room and sat on the mat he had arranged with the person. There were 4 mats in the inner door of the shop. On the mats were small tables that provided meat, food, and wine for customers. Each mat was separated by a thin cloth, but it could not block out the sound. It was just barely enough. Fan Xian sat in the innermost area. The deputy only dared to sit half on the outside. He muttered to himself, unsure why this noble figure had to come to this unremarkable shop. Was he here to see someone? Then, he fearfully accepted the bowl of wine the Duke handed over and carefully took a sip. He then fell into a deep sleep. After eating a few pieces of lamb and drinking 2 bowls of strong wine, Fan Xian's eyes grew brighter and brighter. He glanced at the thin cloth curtain beside him and gave Mu Feng'er a meaningful glance. Mu Feng'er thought for a moment and then picked up the wine bowl. Standing, he lifted the curtain and went to the mat on the other side. When the curtain was raised, Fan Xian's eyes were sharp. He saw that the person was about 40 or 50 years old. However, his face was dark. After all, he was a Hu person, so he couldn't see clearly. The sun was high in the sky and gradually rising. The mud room was still quiet. It was not the right time to drink, so the shop was particularly quiet. There was only Fan Xian's group and the mysterious Hu person. No one knew what Mu Feng'er said to the Hu person. After a long time, the curtain was pulled open. Mu Feng'er nodded at Fan Xian to indicate that he had confirmed the other person's identity. Fan Xian turned his body and stared at the calm-looking Hu person. He found that the other person's hand was holding the wine bowl steadily. There was no change in his eyes. He slowly opened his mouth and said, "You are the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner. Why change your appearance and act so sneakily?" The Hu person put down his wine bowl and glanced at Fan Xian as if he wanted to know this young man's true identity. This gaze was like lightning, piercing straight to the heart and intimidating. However, Fan Xian's expression was cold and he did not react at all. The Hu person's brows rose slightly. It was as if he had not thought that a random official from the Qing Overwatch Council would have such unfathomable shrewdness and power. "Correct, I am Hu Gu." The Hu person, who looked to be 40 or 50 years old, stared at Fan Xian's face with a hawk-like gaze. "He says you are the leader, so I will talk to you." Fan Xian smiled and raised the wine bowl in his hand. "There's not much I want to know. I must first confirm the princess's safety." Hu Gu, the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner of the Western Hu Kingdom. His reputation shook the western frontier and was deeply respected by the Hu people. His bearing was extraordinary. However, when he opened his mouth to speak the language of the Central Plains, he always felt awkward. For some reason, his aura weakened a bit. Fan Xian reached into his clothes and took out a jade hook, which he handed over. After Hu Gu accepted the jade hook, his brows furrowed tightly. It was as if he had sunk into deep thought. Fan Xian did not disturb his memories. He only watched this scene quietly. The Overwatch Council had made contact with this foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner not because Fan Xian had exceptional abilities. Rather, he had used a troublesome method to come to them. Toward such people who came to them of their own accord, the Overwatch Council's usual way of dealing with them was not to be proactive, not to make promises, and not to take responsibility. It was not until he had indeed given the Overwatch Council some useful intelligence that the Overwatch Council began to follow up on this path. Other than Fan Xian himself, there was no one else who could follow up on this path. The reason for the relationship between Hu Gu and the Overwatch Council was Ma Suasua. Ma Suasua was still being hidden by Prince Heching, but in terms of belonging, she was, in the end, Fan Xian's person. This princess of a Hu tribe was a female captive, but also not a female captive. The tribe she belonged to had originally been prepared to surrender to the great prince's troops. However, before they could do so, they were exposed. The entire tribe had been completely slaughtered by the Western Hu king. The remaining tribe members could only scatter to the western regions and seek refuge with the nobility clans. Hu Gu was a warrior who had left this small tribe. Before he could reveal his identity and win glory for his tribe, he received the tragic news that his tribe had been slaughtered. After confirming Hu Ji's identity for Ma Suasua, Fan Xian began to strengthen his secret connection with Hu Gu. Not only did Ma Suasua know Hu Gu, but the two of them had been good friends when they were young. In the words of the Central Plains, they were childhood sweethearts. Fan Xian looked at his old face and muttered to himself. Did the Hu people age so easily when they were exposed to the wind and sun every day? Hu Gu carefully put the jade hook into his clothes. Looking at Fan Xian, he said, I indeed want to avenge my tribe. Don't forget, I am also a Hu person. There are some things I can say and some things I cannot say. You Qing people are too sinister and cunning. I cannot trust you. Fan Xian understood this. If he wanted Hu Gu to lead the way for the Qing army and launch a surprise attack on the Western Hu king's camp, no one in the court would believe him, let alone whether or not he would be willing. He lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, I don't need you to do anything. On the contrary, I can support you in doing something. I heard that the left virtuous prince's situation is not very good. If you can help him stand firm, presumably, your own power will also rise. Without waiting for the Hu tribe ace to speak, Fan Xian waved his hand crisply and said, I don't ask for much in giving you support. First, you must think of all ways to stop the great attack next spring. Even if you can't stop it, I still need your intelligence. Don't worry, the Qing people are straightforward. We won't set up an ambush. We just need to set up a formation and scare each other. You should know how to arrange this. Hu Gu furrowed his brows and said, right now, even the left virtuous prince's words have no power, much less mine. That's your problem. Since it is cooperation, you have to show some sincerity. Fan Xian looked at him calmly. I won't mistreat you. If you want to convince those people, you can't just rely on your fists. All the nobles in the world are the same. They all like gold, silver, jewelry, and silk. Hu Gu glanced at the young official across from him. I'll give you as much as you need to bribe. Fan Xian's tone was very normal, but it revealed a powerful confidence. Furthermore, you want to revive your tribe. Presumably, you'll need a large sum of money. Actually, making a deal with me is very simple. I only need to ask you one question. Do you want to get rich? Fan Xian had once asked some people this question, such as the previous commander of the Northern Qi Brocade Guard, Sir Shenzhong. Sir Shenzhong didn't want to get rich with Fan Xian. He wanted to get rich on his own, so he died. Then, Fan Xian had asked the Northern Qi imperial uncle, Marquis Chong Ning. This marquis was very willing to get rich with Fan Xian. Not only did his family get rich, but Wei Hua also became a high-ranking official. History had long proven that those who worked with Fan Xian were always very happy. But Hu Ge did not know the other party's true identity. He said in a cold voice, "Everyone likes gold and silver, but your words are unbelievable. So much silver, and even goods that can't be bought with silver, you want me to agree to it with just one word. Don't lie to me. Although we, the men of the prairie, are straightforward, we are not fools." Fan Xian's words did indeed sound like a lie. There were many kings' tents on the grasslands and countless nobles. These nobles were all insatiably greedy. If they wanted to fill their appetites, they would need the Qing court's strong support. How could a young official of the Overwatch Council make this decision? "I can give you a good knife produced by the palace treasury." Fan Xian didn't respond to his words. Coldly, he said, "However, the quantity is limited. After all, I don't want the knife I give you to chop at the necks of the Qing people." Fan Xian didn't answer Hu Ge's question. On the contrary, Hu Ge felt even more uneasy. He stared at the young and handsome face and asked in a low and icy voice, "Who exactly are you?" Fan Xian glanced at him and said, "I am Fan Xian." With a crisp clang, Hu Ge's back slammed heavily into the dirt wall. He quickly pulled out the curved knife at his waist and aimed it at Fan Xian. The dust on the dirt wall fell down and stained the food and wine on the table. Hu Ge looked at Fan Xian with great caution. A glimmer of fear rose in his eyes. Fan Xian lowered his head and tapped his fingers on the table. He had not thought that his true identity would scare the other party to such an extent. How could this person be called the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner? He had no idea that the name of Commissioner Fan of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council had long resounded through the world, far away from where the Hu people lived. In the hearts of the Qing people, Sir Fan Jr. was brilliant and eye-catching. In the eyes of the Qing Kingdom's enemies, this legendary young man was the #1 target to guard against. Up until now, the Hu people had never been taken advantage of by Fan Xian. However, they had been taken advantage of by Chen Pingping many times. Thus, they had endless fear and wariness toward Chen Pingping's successor. After Fan Xian admitted his identity, Hu Ge's first thought was that today's meeting was a trap. His second thought was that if this was not a trap, then this transaction would also consign the Hu people to eternal damnation. "Don't be so afraid." Fan Xian raised his head and slowly said, "Correct, I am the head of the Overwatch Council. Don't worry, I am also a good businessman. Don't forget, I control the court's palace treasury. If you don't believe in my trustworthiness, you can send someone to the Central Plain to investigate. I'm not afraid." Hu Ge had already calmed down. A wolf-like wildness appeared in his eyes. Staring at Fan Xian, he enunciated each word clearly, "I just didn't think that someone of your status would lower himself to come see me and be so brave. This is the world of the Qing Kingdom. This is Dingzhou. I don't think there is anything special about my courage." Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Even a Hu person like you dares to come see me. Why wouldn't I dare to see you?" "You don't know how much your head is worth," Hu Ge said. "Are you not afraid that I will set a trap here and kill you?" Fan Xian glanced at him mockingly and wiped the meat oil in his hand onto the cloth curtain beside him. "This shop is filled with your people from top to bottom. If I was afraid of you setting a trap, why would I come in and sit and drink? Besides, do you think you, the so-called foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner, can kill me?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows as if he was looking at an insensible child. "You have a long name, but your courage is not much. A person's name was like a tree's shadow." The most powerful ace of the younger generation in the Qing Kingdom had long branded his figure in the hearts of all martial artists. Hu Ge indeed did not have the courage to carry out such a dangerous attempt. Fan Xian stood and stared into his eyes. "I don't care what you're thinking. Since my conditions are out, I want to know that person's name." This was the piece of intelligence that the Overwatch Council cared about the most in their probing contact with the other party during these 3 months. The person hidden in the Hu king's tent was hidden very deeply. Furthermore, he had brought great harm to the Qing kingdom. The Overwatch Council and Bureau of Military Affairs had tried everything they could but were still unable to find out who that person was. Even the two councils were not sure if there was such a terrifying military advisor in the Hu tribes or if the two virtuous kings and the chief had suddenly been enlightened. Fan Xian did not think so. The Qing emperor also did not think so. The father and son had the same judgment. It was easy to change mountains and rivers, but it was difficult to change a person's nature. The changes in Shi Hu must have been influenced by outside forces. They were certain that that person existed. This was the most important goal of Fan Xian's trip to Dingzhou. He wanted to dig out that person. Hu Gu was the highest-ranking figure the Qing court could come into contact with among the Hu tribe. He had been urged for a long time. Hearing these words again, the expression of this Hu tribe ace changed. He knew how much help he would receive from the Qing court. Furthermore, Suo's life and death were in the hands of this young man in front of him. He didn't have much of a choice. However. Chapter 598. Songji Xianling? This was a completely unfamiliar name. Fan Xian thought of a person called Songgan Zanpu. He shook his head and said, "This is the language of the grasslands." His brows suddenly rose. He thought that if this mysterious person had come to the grasslands from the outside, then this alias must have a true meaning. However, it should have its own meaning. This is the tribal language of the brothers in the north. It is not the language of the grasslands. Hu Gu sheathed his curved knife and said seriously, "I've investigated for 3 months and can already confirm that this person came to the grasslands with the northern tribes. I'm not sure about the meaning of Songji Xianling, but the Xianling should mean twinkling." Fan Xian's brows furrowed. Twinkling. Twinkling. Diamond, diamond, twinkling. He immediately thought of the name wrongly. He didn't think that twinkling could be an adjective or some kind of movement, such as flowers blooming. This proved that the Hu tribes did not have a unified language and would indeed bring trouble to many people. Fan Xian's head hurt. He had too little information on hand. What use could a name have? Helplessly, he raised his eyes and looked at Hu Gu. The brothers in the north are still moving toward the grasslands? Hu Gu nodded with a serious expression. It is already the 4th year. The first year, it was the brothers in the north who came as scouts. There weren't many people. The second year, it was the warriors among the brothers in the north. This group had the most people. In the last 2 years, it has mainly been the elderly, women, and children who had stayed in the north. They have moved with great difficulty along the path open to the side of the meridian of the sky. If Songji Xianling is a tribe member in the north, then what year did he come to the grasslands? It should be the group from before. Although this person is mysterious, since he can influence the decisions of the king's tent, he must have the absolute support of the brothers in the north. Otherwise, who would listen to him? You're saying? Fan Xian stared into Hu Ji's eyes. The brothers in the north have already established themselves on the grasslands and received the king's approval? This is natural. They are very brave. Although there are only tens of thousands of them, almost all of them are warriors. Additionally, their tribes are more united than the people on the grasslands. Furthermore, their requests for water and grass areas are not greedy. Regardless of whether it is the king's tent or the two virtuous kings, they all welcome their arrival, Hu Gu said seriously. Hu Gu said very seriously, also, our brothers in the north never participate in the internal struggles of the grasslands, so they are the targets of all parties. Although their voices are still steady, they seem to be getting louder and louder in our ears. Fan Xian nodded and didn't say anything. The source of the Qing kingdom's tight situation on the western border was because of the continuous natural disasters to the north of northern Qi. Heavy snow sealed the plains and forced the northern barbarians to migrate tens of thousands of li to the grasslands. The ruthlessness of the Western Hu and the tyranny of the northern barbarians combined. The pressure on the Qing border increased. He felt a chill in his heart. If the Hu people truly united, Qing kingdom would be in big trouble. After decades of Qing kingdom conquest, the Hu people had long been weak. Additionally, there was the Overwatch Council's 30 years of slightly weakening provocations and evil schemes. The Shi-Hu side was not a threat. No one would have thought that the arrival of the northern barbarians would be like a shot in the arm for the Hu people. Songji Xianling seemed to have a way to bridge the divide between the Hu people. Tell me about the current situation on the grasslands. Fan Xian looked at Hu Gu in front of him. His expression was calm, but he was thinking that even if Songji Xianling could temporarily unite the Hu people, since he had found Hu Gu, he would certainly be able to tear open a large hole within the Hu people. When he thought of this, he couldn't help but feel a little excited. If the plains were a game of chess, then the next step would be for him and that Songji Xianling to place their pieces on the board. They would go back and forth and see who would emerge victorious in the end. Of course, it was him, Fan Xian thought. He had to win because he had acutely captured Songji Xianling's plan hidden in the deepest depths. He greatly loathed her thoughts. The temperature difference between day and night in the west was great. The sun slowly moved. It was as if the temperature in Dingzhou had given some order. It gradually heated up and cooled down. When the shadow of the mud wall in the city grew longer and longer, the sun set in the west, and the temperature grew lower and lower, Fan Xian and Hu Ji's first meeting came to an end. In his mind, he thought over the information he had obtained from Hu Ji's mouth. Fan Xian confirmed that he had benefited greatly from this trip. He then confirmed the method of contact with the other party, as well as the details of the contact, and began the final exchange of benefits. Regardless of whether it was gold, silver, treasures, silk, tea, or porcelain, it was all transported to the grasslands and handed to Hu Ji's hands without anyone knowing. This in itself was a troublesome matter. Fortunately, although the grasslands and Qing kingdom had fought for decades, the tribes on the grasslands had long become accustomed to paying tribute because the Qing kingdom had always held an absolute advantage. The trade between the two sides had never stopped. In other words, while the two sides were shooting poison arrows at each other at the foot of Tian Shan, perhaps on the other side of the mountain, merchants were laboriously making their way to the grasslands to transport goods to the heart of the central plain in exchange for furs and other things. War and commerce did not interfere with each other. However, it would be difficult to privately smuggle important goods like ironware, salt, and grain. Since Fan Xian had the emperor's personal edict, he did not care about this. Hearing Fan Xian's last words, Hu Gu furrowed his brows and said, "Commissioner, there is trust between us. That is why I am telling you this path. I hope you won't disappoint me. If you really disappoint me, believe me, I won't need the king's tent to move troops. On the grasslands, I will be able to destroy you." Fan Xian knew what this Hu tribe ace was afraid of. He shook his head and said, "Don't worry. Although the scenery on your side is beautiful, I am not used to drinking horse wine. I have no interest in bringing an army over." Having obtained the promise, Hu Gu relaxed slightly. He raised his wine bowl and toasted Fan Xian. He then drained it in one gulp. The wine spilled down and wet his beard and clothes. Fan Xian smiled and raised his wine bowl, preparing to end this transaction. Unexpectedly, he heard a light whistle come from outside the shop. His brows immediately furrowed and he placed the wine bowl back on the table. This whistle was very light, like a shepherd herding a camel. It did not attract the attention of Hu Ji's people. Hu Gu noticed that Fan Xian had placed the wine bowl back on the table. His heart jumped slightly. He thought that Fan Xian still had some conditions. He thought to himself that the Qing people were indeed cunning and always liked to make exorbitant demands. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian looked at him and said, "Are there any problems with the people you brought?" Hu Ji's expression froze slightly. He understood that a problem had occurred outside the shop. He shook his head and said, "They are all children of my tribe scattered to various places. There is absolutely no problem." He knew that the matter was urgent. As he spoke, he began to pack his things and prepare to flee. If the Dingzhou military and governments knew he was in the city, they would stop at nothing to capture him. The two sides had fought fiercely these few years. If they could capture the top ace under the left virtuous king's banner, Dingzhou would be overjoyed. Fan Xian watched his movements but did not rise. He lowered his head and quietly said, "They are still outside the street. The encirclement has not formed. Leave from the back of the house. I'll hold them off for a while for you." Hu Ge looked at him with a strange feeling. He had taken the risk to come to Dingzhou. He had not thought that the person to meet him would be Commissioner Fan of the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council, such an honorable figure. It was precisely because Fan Xian had personally come that Hu Ge had placed more trust in him. This was very beneficial to their future cooperation. "I won't see you out." Fan Xian raised his wine bowl and said, "Be careful on your journey. We'll meet again another day." Hu Ge nodded his head heavily and accepted the heavy package Mu Feng handed over. Putting his finger to his lips, he whistled. Lifting the curtain, he followed the hole in the earth toward the back of the lamb shop. At the same time, a few unremarkable Hu merchants and workers outside the lamb shop also blended into the crowd. They are used to hiding everywhere. After all, their tribe has been massacred for many years. If they want to restore their tribe, there will always be many things that cannot be seen in the light. Mu Feng looked at Fan Xian, who had his head lowered as he drank. He knew what he was worried about and said, "I called the police early. Dingzhou will not be able to catch him." Fan Xian nodded. A few subordinates of the Overwatch Council disguised as Central Plain merchants rushed in and reported, "The guards of the western camp have entered the dirt street and will be here soon." Mu Feng glanced at Fan Xian, meaning to ask if he should retreat at this time. Fan Xian shook his head. Since the Dingzhou army had their eyes on them, then the carriages they had left at the mud wall earlier were also controlled by the other party. The three of them came to the lamb shop, but they left a few 6th Bureau subordinates behind to follow them from a distance. This was to prevent any accidents from happening. Since the two sides had met, there was no need to retreat. For the safety of Hu Ge and his group, Fan Xian had to delay the Qing soldiers capturing the spies for a while. "If the other party doesn't deal a heavy blow, we won't make a move." Fan Xian took a sip of wine and spoke to his subordinates. Mu Feng, and the Overwatch Council officials met each other's eyes and nodded. At this moment, there was a commotion outside the lamb shop and the startling sound of horse hooves. Countless people charged in and surrounded the shop. Faintly, one could hear an official's loud cry. It was like he had discovered that a target had left the lamb shop. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and felt it was very troublesome. He stood up from the brick bed, turned around, and pulled out a piece of bamboo from the mat. He then walked out of the shop. There was a murderous aura outside the shop. There were at least 200 Dingzhou soldiers surrounding the shop. The long spears in their hands were aimed at the people walking out of the shop. The tips of the spears shot out wildly. It was as if they could turn the Central Plain merchants into mincemeat at any moment. Outside the encirclement were the well-behaved merchants. They watched this scene with curiosity and nervousness. They didn't know why the people of the general's manor would use such a large force to deal with these merchants. The clever ones had already guessed that the identities of these merchants were probably not that simple. "I can't let anyone suspect the escaped Hu Ge because of my existence." This was the true meaning hidden in the order Fan Xian had given earlier. This spy the Overwatch Council had hidden in Shi Lake was too important. Fan Xian didn't even dare trust anyone, much less in front of so many people. A soldier moved closer to the officer's ear and said something. The officer's eyes lit up. Presumably, he had confirmed the other party's identity. Looking at Fan Xian and his group, he said in a cold voice, someone, capture these spies. Fan Xian looked at the soldier's face and recognized him as the soldier guarding the east gate. It was this person who had examined their documents to enter the city. He immediately knew where the problem was. He couldn't help smiling helplessly and glancing at Mu Feng. Mu Feng knew that he had made some mistakes in his handling of the details and had aroused the suspicions of Ding Zhou. He was angry in his heart, but he was afraid of angering Fan Xian. His expression became increasingly ugly. Surrounded by countless spears, he looked at the officer with a cold expression. His gaze was as if he was about to bring a bowl of water and swallow him alive. The officer didn't know what these merchants were thinking. Seeing that there was not a glimmer of fear on their faces, he became more and more certain that there was something strange about these merchants. As he prepared to give orders and send out a portion of his subordinates to continue capturing the people who had escaped, he urged his horse to stop in front of the merchants. He couldn't let the Ding Zhou army catch up to Hu Gu. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. Mu Feng received the order. A cold light flashed through his eyes. With a push of his feet, yellow sand appeared. His entire body had already flipped up like a gray shadow. Pressing his palm against the horse's head, a short knife flew out from his sleeve. He was about to restrain the careless officer. Since the officer dared to ride alone in front of everyone, he had great confidence in his skills. Seeing the sudden change, he was not surprised at all. Raising the sheath of his knife with one hand, he slapped it toward Mu Feng's wrist. His right hand left the reins and went straight for Mu Feng's throat. His movements were clean and efficient. It was the authentic Yi family's grappling skills. This officer's martial arts were indeed powerful, but he only thought that these merchants might be spies. He had no idea of their true identities and couldn't help but underestimate them. He blocked Mu Feng, but he couldn't block the black shadows that rose up at almost the same time as Mu Feng. With a number of swishing sounds, the shadows descended on the officer's horse at the same time. One grabbed the hand, the other grabbed the throat. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau attacked. Even Fan Xian was afraid of them, much less this unremarkable soldier of Ding Zhou. With a wail, the horse suddenly realized that there were 4 people standing on its back. How could it withstand it? Its front hooves softened and it fell down. A cloud of dust rose. The Ding Zhou soldiers were shocked. They watched helplessly as their leader was easily captured by the spies. Mu Feng took the officer's knife sheath and placed the knife in his hand across his neck. Facing the Ding Zhou soldiers charging over from all directions, he shouted, "If you're not afraid of death, then come." The officer's face was deathly white. He had not thought that he would not be able to block one move from these spies. Gritting his teeth, he roared at his subordinates, "Capture these people." He now believed that these people were not only spies but very powerful spies. For the sake of Ding Zhou's safety, why would they care about his life or death? He didn't care, but Fan Xian did. If conflict truly erupted, the Ding Zhou army would not be able to keep them, but how would they explain it to the court? "We are not spies." Fan Xian walked forward and looked at everyone warmly. "We are just merchants." With this disturbance, the officer did not have time to give the order to chase. Hu Gu and his group should have already safely escaped the encirclement. Fan Xian's state of mind had also calmed down. He indicated for his subordinates to put down the weapons in their hands. Smiling slightly at the brave officer, he said, "Sir, my subordinates are all rash people. I've frightened you." Naturally, no one believed such words. Even the most rash of Jianghu people would not attack the court's army. The officer touched his tight throat and found that he was still surrounded by these spies. Looking at Fan Xian in the lead, he ruthlessly said, "Let's see where else you can escape to." "We won't escape. We are truly just merchants. We just overreacted earlier." After saying this, Fan Xian couldn't help but want to cry. "Hu Gu, oh Hu Gu, I have truly caused a great deal of trouble for you. Is that so? Which family are you merchants from? The officer looked at Fan Xian darkly as if he was not at all worried about his safety. The Dingzhou soldiers outside didn't know what they were talking about. They only went to make an urgent report to the general's manor. At the same time, they set up the encirclement. No one paid any more attention to the people who could escape from the back of the shop. The Lingnan Xiong family, Mu Feng, said. Since you are merchants, come back with me to the manor for inspection. The officer gritted his teeth so hard they almost shattered. He roared angrily, otherwise, kill them on the spot. In his opinion, these spies were probably about to break out of the encirclement. However, they were controlling him, so it was inconvenient for his subordinates to act. No matter what, if he suggested that these merchants come with him to the general's manor for questioning, the other party would certainly not accept. Unexpectedly, after the young and handsome merchant thought for a moment, he nodded and said, "Very well, we are law-abiding merchants. Of course, we are willing to explain ourselves." The officer furrowed his brows. He didn't know what these spies were thinking. Did they not know that once they were captured, what awaited them would be endless beatings and interrogation? However, since the other party was so muddle-headed and stupid, the officer would not miss this opportunity. "Tie your own hands," he looked at Fan Xian and roared loudly. Fan Xian was obedient, truly obedient. He was even more obedient than he was in front of the emperor. He obediently allowed the Dingzhou soldiers to tie him up like a rice dumpling. Furthermore, his shoulder was hit heavily by a soldier. It was truly painful. The Overwatch Council officials under him were also obedient and obediently allowed themselves to be captured without a trace of struggle. On the contrary, it confused the Dingzhou soldiers. Because these merchant-like spies had once subdued their immediate superior in one move, these soldiers did not hold back. As they tied them up, they secretly used some heavy blows. Fan Xian stood by the officer's side and pleaded, "Don't hit people." The officer glared at him. He couldn't understand how this spy could be so daring. Resisting in the street was a small matter, but he could still speak to him so calmly. "There is still someone in the shop who has been drugged by us. Don't forget to bring him back with you." Fan Xian was more like a Dingzhou advisor. "What's with all this nonsense? Just wait until you can't even die if you want to," he said sinisterly as he stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Fan Xian did not get angry. He forced a smile and said, "The merchants I brought into the city have presumably also been captured by you. Please say something and don't torture them." The officer glanced at him mockingly. He had seen countless spies, but this was the first time he had seen someone as childish and laughable as Fan Xian. Fan Xian looked at him and said seriously, "We didn't kill you earlier. How about you return our favor?" The officer became more and more confused. He felt a chill in the depths of his heart and wondered if he had done something wrong. He subconsciously stopped his subordinates from beating up the spies. Something major had happened in Dingzhou. Another group of spies had been captured. Although there were spies every year and there were new ones every month, the spies captured in the lamb shop were different. First, they had come from the heart of the Central Plain. No one knew if they wanted to do illicit salt business with Shihu or if they had a bigger plan. Second, these spies were clearly strange. The upper echelons of the Dingzhou army took great interest in this group of spies. They had always disagreed with the court and Overwatch Council's decisions. They thought that there was no godlike military advisor in the Western Hu King's tent. The reason the Hu people had been so powerful these years was all because someone within the court had colluded with them and provided them with large amounts of support. These merchant spies who came from Jiangnan through Jingdo seemed to confirm this point even more clearly. This was a serious matter, so there was no time to use torture to interrogate these spies. Before the governor's manor could reach out, the commander of the military in Dingzhou had ordered the spies to be escorted back to the general's manor. When it came to stealing credit, regardless of whether it was the front line or the rear, it was all the same. The officer escorted Fan Xian and his group into the general's manor. He found that the general was personally interrogating them. He couldn't help feeling happy. He thought to himself that although he had made a fool of himself today, he had captured these important people. His merits still outweighed his faults. We still haven't had time to ask. The general sitting at the top ground his teeth until they creaked. Then what are we waiting for? First, break their legs and then flog them 30 times. Then, we can question them. The Dingzhou soldiers below shouted in unison and prepared to take action. The general spat on the ground and cursed, "Motherf asterisk cur, how dare you not kneel in front of me? You're quite unyielding. What bullsh asterisk T Xiong family of Lingnan? Even if you're from Xiaomingji, I'll still beat you up." Everyone in court and the military knew that Xiaomingji was Commissioner Fan's family property. There was basically no one in this world who dared to not give Fan Xian face. Strangely, this general's tone did not sound like he was bragging. Fan Xian raised his head with a pained expression and looked at the bearded general of the Western expedition. He wondered why this kid was so ugly. He sighed and said, "We can't beat them." The Western expedition camp's imperial general, Li Hongsheng, was angrily drinking strong wine. He wondered why these bastard people never let him relax. Suddenly hearing these words, he unconsciously looked down the hall and unexpectedly saw a familiar face. The features on that face had changed slightly, but the mischievousness in his eyes was just as strong as it was in the past. Chapter 599. The official wiped away the wine on his face and looked stupidly at the general. He didn't know why the general was angry. Was it because he had embarrassed the general's manner on the street earlier, so the general was using this method of spraying strong wine in his face to express his strong disdain for him? General Li Hongqing didn't even glance at this trusted aide. He looked stupidly at Fan Xian disguised as a merchant in the hall. He opened his mouth and used his index finger to point downward. He tapped quickly but didn't say anything. Fan Xian glanced at him, narrowed his eyes, and shook his head imperceptibly. Li Hongqing quickly suppressed the shock in his heart. He coughed and cleared his throat. Glancing at his subordinates around him, he said, "All of you, go down and organize the files. In a moment, the governor's manor will come to snatch people. Stop them with all your might." Yes. The soldiers who had escorted the spy into the manor accepted the order and left. However, the official and a few of the general's trusted aides and secretaries did not leave. "General, we're not interrogating him." The official wiped the wine off his face and looked at his superior with confusion. Li Hongqing flew into a rage and said, "Interrogating my ass. We can't beat him, how can we interrogate him? Can't beat him?" Could it be that the words of the spy had really convinced the great general? The official looked at Li Hongqing like an idiot and couldn't react for a moment. He felt that life seemed to be too absurd. After the manor had quieted down, Fan Xian opened his mouth and asked with a smile, "These 4 people haven't left. It looks like they are your trusted aides?" Li Hongqing had long jumped up from the hall. As he walked down, he muttered, "Nonsense, if they aren't trustworthy people, they wouldn't dare stay here." "That's good." Fan Xian didn't seem to use much strength, but the ox tendon ropes binding his arms snapped inch by inch and fell to the ground. The 4 trusted aides of the general's manor stared with wide eyes, not daring to believe their own eyes. They wondered what kind of ace this person was. They had a deeper understanding of the absurdity of life. This was an ox tendon rope specially made by the military. It was enough to tie up a 9th-level ace. How could this person so easily break free? They had no idea that the tyrannical jinqi in Fan Xian's body had already reached its peak. Coupled with the special nature of this jinqi, once it was fully unleashed, it could be said to be invincible. The 4 of them watched as Fan Xian escaped. Unconsciously, they wanted to pull out their weapons and attack. Fortunately, they were not truly idiots. They could already see that the situation on the field was a bit strange. They hesitantly looked at each other and felt weak in their legs. Fan Xian touched his bound wrists and looked at Li Hongqing in front of him. Your subordinates are really ruthless. Nonsense. Li Hongqing punched him on the shoulder and said, "Why are you here, you little brat?" He almost caused a big mess. Fan Xian felt the pain and said, "I was hit by your people, don't hammer me." Li Hongqing heard it clearly. This bastard was using the opportunity to snitch on him. As a general, he knew the way the people under him did things. He also knew that someone of Fan Xian's status would not retaliate over such a small matter. He chuckled and didn't reply. He wanted to muddle his way through. "Sir?" The officer finally found it difficult to bear the absurdity of his life and couldn't resist opening his mouth to ask. Fan Xian turned around and pointed at the still sleeping deputy official on the chair. "This person knows my identity. Don't let him out for now. We'll talk about it after the matter is finished." Li Hongqing nodded and hugged his shoulder. Smiling widely, he said, "News from the capital says it will be at least 10 days before you arrive. Coming so early, is there something good? I am now the local tyrant of Dingzhou. If there's anything good, you can give me a share." Fan Xian furrowed his brows and glanced at him. He felt more and more strange in his heart. Why was this noble heir now like a ruffian? Particularly with the sour smell on his body, he shivered and broke away from the other person's warm embrace. "There's nothing good, but there's a pile of bad things. In any case, I can't tell you. There are just some things I need your help with." When these two superiors talked about serious matters, they forgot these subordinates to the side. The 4 trusted aides of the general's manor had already faintly heard the origins of these so-called spies. They couldn't help but look at each other. They then looked at the people tied up like dumplings with green and red patches on their faces. Involuntarily, their hearts began to pound. They thought to themselves that if they really beat up the court spies, given the legendary ruthless and protective temper of the Overwatch Council's old ancestor and little ancestor, what would they do? "Should we untie these brothers?" The officer couldn't resist asking Li Hongqing. Li Hongqing scolded, "Troublesome little ruffians, hurry up and untie them." Quickly, these 4 people released Fan Xian's Overwatch Council subordinates. They then stood to the side, at a loss as to what to do. They smiled apologetically and said apologetic words. The Overwatch Council subordinates did not show any anger. They were used to being spies, so they didn't care about such small problems. Seal off the news. Not a single word of it can get out. As for if anyone asks about the spies that were brought into the manor today, say the general's manor is secretly interrogating them. No one knew what Fan Xian said to Li Hongqing. Li Hongqing turned his head and said a few things in a cold voice. He then gave some orders to ensure that the whereabouts of Fan Xian and his group would not be revealed. In 3 days, choose some prisoners on death row from the prison. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "My subordinates will help clean up the people in your manor as to what to do next. Naturally, they will do these things. We have to talk first." Li Hongqing continued to hold Fan Xian's arm like he was afraid he would run. He dragged him toward the back garden. The remaining officials of the general's manor and the Overwatch Council watched as their immediate superiors left with their arms around each other's shoulders. They couldn't help but stare at each other and sink into silence. They didn't know how to address each other or how to deal with related matters. After a long time, it was still the officer who had brought them into the manor who coughed and looked at Mu Feng. In a gentle voice, he said, "Sir, are you from the council?" Mu Feng nodded and did not give this person a pleasant expression. Then, that sir earlier was Sir Fan Jr.? The officer lowered his voice and asked with slight fear. Mu Feng knew of the close relationship between the commissioner and King Jing's heir and nodded his head seriously. The officer swallowed. Only now did he know what kind of person he had captured. Thinking that the other party was the little ancestor of the Overwatch Council he had been afraid of earlier, his face began to pale, whiter than the flowers on the grasslands. The general's manor was originally the manor of the Yi family. Later, Li Hongqing entered the Western Expedition Army. Given his identity, he had always lived here. 2 years ago, during the Jingdou Rebellion, half of the Dingzhou army entered the capital to quell the rebellion. Yi Zhong and Gong Dian remained in Jingdou and never returned. Thus, the general's manor became Li Hongqing's private manor and office. There were no other people in the manor. Walking all the way to the back garden, they didn't see a single servant. Fan Xian was secretly surprised, but he didn't show it on his face. Sitting on a cold stone bench in the garden, he got used to the cold and harsh atmosphere that was completely different from the gardens of the Central Plain. Only then did he speak carefully and say, "You have to explain clearly to your subordinates that no one can think that I entered Dingzhou today. So wordy. You came 10 days early to do business. The problem is, given your current identity, what is there to be afraid of?" Li Hongqing carried a large pot of wine and poured 2 bowls, placing them in front of each other. "I don't want people with ulterior motives to guess that I'm here to see someone because of my early arrival." Li Hongqing's hand holding the pot of wine paused for a moment. Fan Xian looked at him and said, "I won't hide this from you. I buried a spy on the grasslands. Today, I came to see this spy, but..." He emphasized his tone. "Other than you, I don't want anyone else to know about this because the life and death of that spy will affect the lives and deaths of many people in the Qing kingdom." Li Hongqing thought for a moment and then nodded. He then said, "Just as you said earlier, I will take care of it. I will pick some prisoners on the death row to impersonate you. It will not raise any suspicions of people outside." "There is one more important thing," Fan Xian said. "The council needs a path to the Shihu tribe, and I don't want to be raided by the troops under your command, so I need your cooperation." Li Hongqing had already shaken off his earlier surprise and recovered his calm. "What exactly do you want to do?" "I will only remind you of one thing. Any grain you send to the grasslands could kill a soldier of the Qing kingdom." Without waiting for Fan Xian to open his mouth to explain, Li Hongqing stared into his eyes and continued, "I don't care what the court thinks. I don't care what schemes Director Chen has. I don't care if you are preparing to raise a spy to cause internal strife among the Hu people. However, I must remind you that the Hu people are a completely different kind of existence. You are not on the border, so you don't know their savagery and fickleness. You have to be careful about nurturing a tiger and inviting disaster." Fan Xian could feel the affection contained in the other party's warning. He nodded and comfortingly said, "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing." He raised his wine bowl and drank it all with Li Hongqing. He then let out a long breath and looked at the other party's bearded face and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The two of them sank into silence at the same time. The back garden was completely silent. King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing, had joined the army 3 years ago. During these 3 years, he had bravely killed the enemy and led the troops in battle. His reputation had long spread back to Jingdou and the Central Plain. The people all praised that after the great prince's western expedition, the royal family had finally produced another powerful figure who could lead troops into battle. It was because of his military service that this member of the royal family, who once had an unclear relationship with the second prince, was able to obtain the emperor's trust and take over Yi Zhong's position. He began to control the military affairs of the entire Dingzhou western camp. However, it had already been 3 years. This once dissolute, confident, and handsome heir had been polished into a different appearance by the wind and sand of the frontier fortress. Furthermore, he had not returned to Jingdou in 3 years. 3 years. Although the border is tight, looking at how you are in the general's manor, it's not like you don't have time to return to the capital. Fan Xian filled 2 bowls with strong wine and quietly said, "Why don't you go back?" Li Hongqing's hand gripped the edge of the wine bowl. His expression was heavy. After a long time, he slowly said, "Go back to do what?" Fan Xian knew what he was afraid of and glanced at him with disapproval. "It's all in the past. If the emperor doubted you, how could he let you control the affairs of Dingzhou? To put it nicely, I am a general, but my control over the army is far lacking compared to the Yi families," Li Hongqing said with his head lowered. Li Hongqing lowered his head and said, "Of course, I also don't want the western camp to become my family's soldiers. As you can see, I only have 4 trusted aides in the manor. The officer who brought you into the manor is a member of the Yi family. I can trust him, but I can't trust the officials in Jingdou. During these 2 years, the emperor has carried out a total of 4 rotations. 1 in Yanjing, 1 in Nanzhou, and the other 4 roads have all come to Dingzhou to play." Li Hongqing raised his head and stared into Fan Xian's eyes. "Although you have never been in command of an army, you should know that famous generals use experienced soldiers. This iron camp is truly flowing soldiers. If the general doesn't know the soldiers, how can the battle be good? When you return to Jingdou this time, you have to help me with something. Tell the emperor that the rotation cannot continue," Li Hongqing said in a heavy tone. "The replenishment of troops has indeed become more than enough because of the rotation, but when it comes to fighting, it is not the case at all. Furthermore, the attacks of the 14 Hu tribes are becoming fiercer and more cunning." Fan Xian cut off his words and said, "I know you've sent a document to the Bureau of Military Affairs. I've also seen the secret memorial you sent to the emperor, but you should know why the emperor has rotated these 2 years. Yanjing and Sangzhou are in a stalemate. The emperor is using the Hu people to sharpen his knives and train his soldiers for the future. It is a very difficult matter for you to make the emperor stop this move." "I don't care about the great cause of unifying the world," Li Hongqing said angrily. Li Hongqing said angrily, "That's right. If the day of the war comes, I am willing to be the emperor's vanguard and fight to the death on the battlefield. But right now, we are in such a tight spot. If Shiliang Road is really crippled by the Hu people, how can we unify the world?" At this moment, there was only Fan Xian and him in the garden, so his words were particularly direct. He criticized the emperor's national policy as bullsh*t. In any case, he knew Fan Xian's personality and didn't care if he heard it. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and said, "What can I do? In terms of military affairs, the emperor has never allowed me to interfere. It's not like you don't know." Li Hongqing sighed and raised his wine bowl to drink it all in one gulp. Cursing, he said in a low and pained voice, "It is possible to use war to train soldiers. However, 10 batches of new soldiers come, 7 batches go back, and 3 batches die on the grasslands. If we still use the old Dingzhou soldiers or the old subordinates of the Western Expedition Army that the Great Prince brought out, these people wouldn't have to die." But Fan Xian knew he had to remind Hongqing of some things to prevent him from unknowingly committing a taboo in the future. "If we only use the Dingzhou army and the old subordinates of the Western Expedition Army, how can we attack northern Qi and Dongyi? During the Jingdou rebellion 2 years ago, the Qin family's rebel army was almost completely wiped out. The internal structure of the army suddenly became unstable, and military power dropped rapidly. The emperor must use Dingzhou to pick up the edge of the Qing army again. There's no need to talk about this anymore. Don't bring this up to the court again. Not only will it have no effect, but it will also make the emperor unhappy. Of course, the emperor won't just watch you suffer here alone." A slightly mocking smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. "Am I not also here?" Li Hongqing shook his head and didn't continue to discuss this topic. Fan Xian looked at him and suddenly said, "How often do you bathe now?" Li Hongqing paused. "I don't remember. About half a month to a month." Fan Xian sniffled and laughingly scolded, "No wonder you smell so bad." Li Hongqing glared at him. Fan Xian smiled. "Dingzhou has deep wells. There's no shortage of water. Furthermore, you're a general. Can't you even bathe? I'm too lazy. Li Hongqing smiled and shook his head. If you were like me and had once spent half a year fighting the Hu people on the grasslands and deserts, you would also be used to days without bathing. Besides, it's all work that involves fighting and carrying sticks. Beside me are a group of rough people. Who would care about this? The subordinates don't care, but do the concubines in the manor not care? Fan Xian picked up a cucumber and stuffed it into his mouth to chew as he spoke indistinctly. Li Hongqing paused. A moment later, he smiled slightly and said, "There are no concubines in the manor. The people of the Yi family have all returned to the capital. I only left behind a few servants." Fan Xian raised his head in shock, not daring to believe his ears. King Jing's heir, Li Hongqing, had been famous in Jingdo for his dissolute ways. He secretly helped the second prince manage half the brothels and women under heaven. It could truly be said that he had a new person by his bed every night. Now, he was alone in Dingzhou without a single concubine by his side. Seeming to guess what Fan Xian was thinking, Li Hongqing used his index finger to gently tap the wine bowl and quietly said, "Ruoruo doesn't like it, so I quit." Fan Xian was speechless. A moment later, he faintly said, "I've let you down in this matter." "What have you done to let me down?" Li Hongqing laughingly scolded. Fan Xian shook his head and didn't say anything more. He opened his mouth and said, "When I first saw you at Yishur Tavern, you had an assistant at your side. You were free and at ease. I didn't expect you to become like this now. There's nothing bad about this appearance." Li Hongqing thought of the things that had happened around him these 5 or 6 years and felt slightly moved. That day at Yishur Tavern, there was also Guo Baokuan, He Zongwei, and their group. If Li Hongqing hadn't brought it up, Fan Xian might have already forgotten who Guo Baokuan was. "You punched Guo Baokuan and later broke up his family," Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian and said with a not quite there smile. Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian and said with a not quite there smile, "He Zongwei has now become a very popular person in court and the emperor's favorite official. The affairs of the world are all like this. For me to be able to stay out of it, relatively speaking, is not bad." Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. "You're ruthless enough. Before you entered the capital, Jingdo had been peaceful for a dozen years," Li Hongqing continued. "Ever since you entered the capital, people began to die one after another. Presumably, you also did not expect that bastard, He Zongwei, to be able to climb to his current position. The Imperial Censorate has your Overwatch Council by the neck in the capital. He has begun to enter the Hall of Governmental Affairs to discuss matters and has already begun to threaten you." It had to be said that Li Hongqing and Fan Xian's attitude toward Sir He was strangely the same. Solemn. This was because they both held grudges and remembered He Zongwei's desire to eat Fan Ruoruo, the snow swan. Fan Xian smiled slightly mockingly and said, "The higher He Zongwei climbs, the faster he will fall in the future. I'm not worried about anything." "Of course, you're not afraid of him." Li Hongqing smiled. "Although I haven't returned to the capital, I've heard of the nickname, Servant of 3 Surnames. You must have come up with it." Fan Xian chuckled, tacitly agreeing to it. Li Hongqing pointed at his nose and sighed. "You still use the same tricks. First, you ruin someone's reputation. Then, using the emperor's favor, you begin to play unreasonable and sinister tricks. However, let me remind you that He Zongwei is not like me or the second prince. He is an official the emperor has raised. You cannot touch him lightly." This was indeed a trick that Fan Xian often used. Back then, he had used this trick to push the matter of killing prostitutes and ruining their reputations onto the shoulders of the second prince and Li Hongqing. In the end, he had forced the second prince to make a dangerous move. Then, Li Hongqing had been imprisoned in his manor by King Jing for half a year. Correct, there are many officials in the court who are beginning to cling to He Zongwei's leg, servant of 3 surnames. Actually, the master he has always followed has always been surnamed Li. Furthermore, officials are not afraid of things like reputation, Fan Xian said mockingly. However, these officials probably did not think that no matter how the situation in the court develops, He Zongwei will find it difficult to escape death. What do you mean? Fan Xian didn't hide anything in front of Li Hongcheng. He smiled coldly and said, the emperor used the imperial censorate to check and balance the Overwatch Council and reduce its power. This was something he told me beforehand. I agree with this rule. The Overwatch Council's dominance is not a good thing for the court or the people. But, the Overwatch Council's vicious reputation is here. The emperor had to choose an official who dared to oppose me. Thus, he chose He Zongwei because he knew that no matter how things developed in the future, I would not let him go. A cold taste rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Thus, he could only work hard to climb up. However, no matter how powerful he was and how he developed the imperial censorate to the point where it could oppose the Overwatch Council, so what? It was the yamen of the imperial censorate that rose up, not him. On the day that the Overwatch Council truly becomes the censorate, He Zongwei will no longer have any value. Fan Xian shook his head. The emperor only has so many sons. Only the 3rd prince can inherit the throne. Regardless of what the 3rd prince thinks in the future, he will have to consider my attitude before he inherits. He Zongwei has suppressed me for so long. What if he doesn't pay a price? He is grass without roots. He is only grasped in the emperor's hands. Thus, his life depends on how many years the emperor can live. Hearing this, Li Hongcheng felt a chill in his heart. Fan Xian closed his eyes and said, everyone thinks the emperor is healthy and a great grandmaster. No one has thought that the emperor is now a man in his 50s or 60s. Li Hongcheng shook his head. I have to admit, I don't see things as far as you do. Naturally. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been locked up in the manor by King Jing for so long. Fan Xian smiled slightly at him. Now that I think about it, you saved my life, Li Hongcheng said with his head lowered. If I had stayed in Jingdo 2 years ago, I'm afraid I would already be dead. He raised his head and sighed deeply. Just like the 2nd prince. At the mention of the dead, the atmosphere became oppressive again. After a long time, Li Hongcheng forced a smile and said, of course, this matter cannot be blamed on you. The words you said to the 2nd prince in the tea shop outside Baoyue brothel that day, he later told me. I know you just wanted to bring the 2nd prince down and save his life. However, he is actually as stubborn as you. He doesn't listen to what others say. From the beginning, Li Hongcheng had stood behind the 2nd prince in the battle for the throne. After Fan Xian took control of the Overwatch Council, his powerful attacks had only beaten Li Hongcheng out of the poisonous waters of Jingdo. He had not beaten the 2nd prince out. Fan Xian knew that the reason Hongcheng supported the 2nd prince was not just because of future benefits. Rather, it was because they were good friends to begin with. I am very sorry for their departure, Fan Xian said. But, there are too many things in this world that we cannot completely solve. I've always been curious. Li Hongcheng stared into Fan Xian's eyes. Regardless of whether it is the 2nd prince or the crown prince, they are both working hard to carry out certain things. It seems that only you, from the beginning, determined that the torment of these princes would end in a painful failure. How did you determine this? Did you, from the beginning, calculate that they had no chance of success? This has to do with my education from a young age, Fan Xian replied seriously. Fan Xian replied seriously, when I was young, grandmother would hold me and endlessly tell me that the emperor was like this, the emperor was like that, the emperor was undefeatable, and the emperor was like this. I got used to it, so I accepted it. Furthermore, he shook his head. In the end, reality proved that the emperor was indeed undefeatable. Li Hongcheng was silent and speechless. He could only shake his head. You should go back to Jingdo. I know you're afraid of being reminded of the past, but it's good to see the second prince. He, Chengqian, the empress, and the eldest princess are all buried on a beautiful hill. The scenery is not bad. Fan Xian sincerely persuaded this prodigal son who had left home and refused to return. Besides, the prince's health is getting worse and worse. As his son, you have to go back and see. Li Hongqing did not agree. He only sincerely said, Father was seriously ill last year. It was all thanks to you taking care of him. Rojia's letter said thank you. There is no need for thanks between us. Fan Xian looked at him and casually said, at the end of the year, Ruoruo will be returning to the capital. Li Hongqing abruptly raised his head. His eyes lit up. Yi Ling came to Dingzhou to relax. How come I don't see her? Fan Xian did not continue the previous question. Instead, he asked about another person he cared about a lot. After the second prince died, Wan had accompanied Yi Ling for a while. In the end, it was not very effective. Later, it was Yi Zhong who asked for an edict to have his daughter sent back to Dingzhou, where she had grown up. Li Hongqing was in Dingzhou. His friendship with the second prince was not shallow. It was indeed appropriate for him to take care of Yi Ling. Li Hongqing laughed bitterly and said, after this Wang Fei saw the grasslands, her mood improved greatly. However, she is not someone who can stay idle. At this time, she is in Qingzhou. Qingzhou? Fan Xian sucked in a cold breath and said with blame, that is the farthest city. It could start a war with Shihu at any moment. What can I do? Li Hongqing glared at him. There are countless old Yi family generals in the western camp. Those generals look at Yi Ling like she is a little ancestor. They don't even dare to make a sound. If she wants to go to the frontier to fight, kill, and heal, how can I stop her? Fan Xian repeatedly shook his head and scolded, what nonsense. Immediately after, he suddenly thought of something and said, fortunately, I'm about to go to Qingzhou. When I come back, I'll kidnap her and bring her back. After these words were said, it was Li Hongqing's turn to suck in a cold breath. He cursed angrily, you're going to Qingzhou? Do you want something to happen and then the emperor to slaughter the entire Dingzhou army to accompany you in death? The cover has changed. Everyone, please look. This is the final Qingyu year cover. Thank you for bringing out the crazy knife again. Also, I'm about to add the introduction. Yes, it's the last volume. I've done everything that needs to be done. Friends with monthly votes, please help vote. This month, I still need everyone's support. If I don't ask, there won't be any votes. Objective reality, please help me. P.S. I recommend a book, Food and Lust in the Tang Dynasty. The introduction is as follows. A few voluptuous girls, because they were drunk, transmigrated to the Tang dynasty. They don't understand ancient Chinese and can't read ancient characters. With great difficulty, they start a business and settle down peacefully. Then, they run into Li Er wanting to cause trouble at Xuanwu Gate. Seeing that their dream of food and lust had become a bubble, survival or destruction was the question they needed to consider. Book number 1049646. Chapter 600. Fan Xian looked at him with an indifferent laziness in his eyes. Although Qingzhou is at the front lines, it is, after all, under the control of the western camp. There is no need to be so afraid. Li Hongqing used his finger to point at his nose and said angrily, you are a high official and noble. You want to go to Qingzhou with just a thought. Don't you know how much trouble you will cause? Qingzhou was the furthest city in the Qing kingdom. It was the land the great prince had forcefully taken when he first led troops. It was also the newest city. It hung on the edge of the grasslands and was empty on three sides. It was often at the point of conflict between the two sides. If Shi Hu knew that the Overwatch Council and Fan Xian had entered deep into Qingzhou, they would probably attack at all costs. Fan Xian swatted away the finger that was about to point at his face and angrily said, "Are you not a high official and noble? Is Prince He not? Is Yi Ling a not? But we are all in the military camp." Li Hongqing looked at him and angrily raised his voice. "You think I don't know you? You will stop when you reach Qingzhou? I know you too well. With the grasslands in front of you, would you not want to go in? You like to take risks. You like to be sneaky. You never follow the group forward or backward. Can I just watch as you slip into the grasslands under my rule?" Li Hongqing gritted his teeth. "I'm telling you, there is no way." Fan Xian was silent. He had not thought that Li Hongqing would see through his plans at a glance. However, the dark fire in his heart was still burning. He had to enter Qingzhou and see what was happening, even if he didn't enter the grasslands. "I promise you, I won't bring my subordinates into the grasslands." He gazed at Li Hongqing and said seriously, "I just want to go to Qingzhou to investigate some things. If I don't come, no one will know exactly what has happened. Believe me, this matter is very important." "What are you investigating in Qingzhou?" Li Hongqing calmed down and looked at him. "If you have an edict, I will let you go. If not, then don't say any more." "If I had an edict, why would I be talking to you?" Fan Xian saw that he was being stubborn and couldn't help but become angry. "Don't forget, I am an imperial envoy. His Majesty has allowed me to act at my discretion. I am informing you because I respect you. If I really want to go to Qingzhou, what are you going to do to stop me?" Hearing this, Li Hongqing gritted his teeth but couldn't find any words to refute. A moment later, he said in a cold voice, "I must warn you, the border is not the same as before. It's easy to die. The Hu people have become more and more sinister, their methods are similar to yours. Why were you able to capture me when you brought the Overwatch Council into the city earlier? It is because many spies have infiltrated Dingzhou." The Western Camp and the Governor's Manor of Xiliang Road are both nervous about this matter. "Your disguises can't even fool me, much less those who." Li Hongqing stared into his eyes and tried to persuade him. "Yi Linger is different from you. The Yi family is still respected by the Hu people in the West, but your reputation represents the face of the court. If the Hu people can kill you, they will pay any price." "Spies, there are indeed many spies," Fan Xian let out a long breath and faintly said. Fan Xian let out a long breath and faintly said, "In the past 30 years, the Hu people have been unable to send spies into our territory because we look too different. In these 2 years, it has increased. I am also very curious as to where these spies who sell our intelligence to the Hu people came from." A strange light flashed through Li Hongqing's eyes. Fan Xian gazed at him and said, "The most important purpose of my trip this time is to dig out that person, as well as everyone connected to that person. For this matter, I have prepared for 4 whole months. If you want to stop me, go ask the Emperor for an edict." Li Hongqing raised his hands to indicate that he had given up. However, he continued to smile coldly and said, "Have you thought about what would happen to the Emperor if something happened to you? What would happen to the people of the Western Camp? You overestimate the Hu people." Fan Xian lowered his eyelids slightly and mockingly said, "You underestimate me." Li Hongqing was startled. Suddenly, he pulled him in and walked toward the study where the map was kept. After walking through the garden, they came to a room. Lighting a lamp, Li Hongqing spread out a large map and slapped his palm heavily on a spot in the extreme west. In a cold voice, he said, "Look at the position of Qingzhou. It is 200 li away. If you want to go, I will send a troop of 1,000 people to escort you. If you don't want people to escort you, then I want to know, if the Hu people suddenly attack in the last 30 li of the flat desert, how will you deal with it?" Fan Xian looked at the map carefully. Although he had studied this map many times in the Jingdo Council, looking at it again now, he still felt a chill. The road to Qingzhou was close to the edge of the grasslands. Using their ability to come and go unpredictably on the grasslands, the Hu people could indeed launch an attack at any time. I am a merchant. The Hu people do not kill merchants, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. In his heart, he was thinking about the agreement he had with Hu Gu. Li Hongqing did not respond to his words. Pointing at the map, he said, "These 2 years, the Hu people have come out of the grasslands every day to sweep through the fields behind Qingzhou. Do you know how many people have died? Once the Hu people get into a killing frenzy, who cares if you are a merchant or not? Even if you are a 9th level ace, if you are faced with hundreds of roaming riders, what way do you have to escape?" Without waiting for Fan Xian to respond, his finger continued to move on the map. Look at this area. This is the direction the Hu people are mainly attacking. In these 2 years, over 1,000 field army soldiers have died. Fan Xian knew of the tragedy on the border and said, "Is there no way to solve this problem? I can guarantee that the metal riders under my command will not lose to the Hu people's roaming riders. However, this is like 2 people stabbing knives at each other. Both knives are sharp, but the target is different. They don't dare to touch my main force, but I can't catch their main force." Fan Xian said thoughtfully, "The Hu people's camps are moving, but our people are tied to the ground because of the fields. The damage they do to us is greater than the damage we do to them." Li Hongqing nodded his head helplessly. "That is why I have to go to Qingzhou. I have to see just who the master who invented this kind of bastardly tactic is." Fan Xian's eyes were cold. An underworld fire began to burn amidst the coldness. Knowing that he could not convince Fan Xian, Li Hongqing stared into his eyes and asked, "Why is the Overwatch Council paying so much attention to the Xiliang matter?" "It's not council business, it's my private matter." Fan Xian's mood was clearly terrible. Looking at the red dots on the map, he said, "Of course, it's not just a private matter. I have to stabilize the situation in the West before next year. I need your help. At the same time, I also have to cut off the support the Hu people have." "Before next year?" Li Hongqing looked at him with confusion. He didn't know why he was so anxious about the situation in the West. "Next year, Sigu Jian can, at most, hold out until next spring," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. Fan Xian lowered his head and said, "The 4th Bureau put most of its attention on observing Sigu Jian's injury. This great grandmaster is really good at enduring. He actually managed to endure this much longer than expected. Although he has not seen any outsiders in these 2 years, we know that he is still alive, and we also know that he will die next year. What does Sigu Jian's life and death have to do with the West?" Li Hongqing asked angrily. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at him. "Because if Sigu Jian dies, the emperor will send me to Dongyi. I will no longer have time to resolve the problems in the West." Li Hongqing laughed coldly and said, "Do you think you can resolve everything in the world by yourself? I acknowledge your ability, but I hope you don't think too highly of yourself." Fan Xian knew that the other party's words did not have any ill intentions. He spread out his hands and said, "After Sigu Jian, Dongyi will always lean to one side, regardless of whether it is the Qing kingdom or northern Qi. The biggest problem is how do we smoothly transition Dongyi into our hands? Or if the 2 sides fight, Dongyi can still maintain a neutral position. That's impossible." Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly and shook his head. "Once Sigu Jian dies, the conflict between the master of the city and the sword hut will explode. What right does Dongyi have to be neutral? But, you still haven't explained what this has to do with you rushing to Xiliang." Fan Xian glanced at Li Hongqing helplessly. After a moment of silence, he said in a low voice, "The reason is simple. I have to prove to the world that I can resolve the problems of Xiliang and Dongyi." "And then?" Li Hongqing looked at him suspiciously. "Then, I want to prove to the emperor that if I'm saying if we truly want to unify the world, we don't necessarily have to fight. Even if we have to fight, it doesn't have to be a martial battle. A civil attack is also possible. Even if we have to fight, if we can, we will. Fan Xian's voice grew quieter and quieter. It was so quiet that even he didn't believe these words. Li Hongqing was also dumbfounded. He sat silently to the side, wondering if he had heard incorrectly. Li Hongqing suddenly stood up and quickly paced back and forth in the study. It was as if he was digesting the news he had just heard. A moment later, he stood by Fan Xian's side and laughed uncontrollably. His laughter was filled with absurdity. Are you an idiot? Li Hongqing let loose a torrent of abuse at him. How can you think of such a childish idea? Do you think you're an immortal who can resolve the Hu people without using a single soldier? Without using a single soldier, you can resolve Dongyi and Northern Qi? Li Hongqing's entire body shook with anger. Pointing at Fan Xian's face, his fingertips shook wildly. I thought you had some great idea going to Qingzhou, but it's such a childish and chaotic battle. What exactly do you want to do? Have you really been flattered by the Imperial College students to the point of forgetting your own name? Do you really want to be a saint? Li Hongqing abruptly grabbed Fan Xian's clothes and gritted his teeth. Are you crazy? No one in the world will obediently do as you say just because of what you think. The two of their faces were very close. Li Hongqing looked at the darkness in Fan Xian's eyes and roared in a low voice, "Prove to the Emperor? What exactly are you thinking about?" Fan Xian lowered his head and said in a low voice, "What am I thinking about? If I said I hoped for the world to be peaceful and without war, would you think this idea was absurd?" Li Hongqing let go of his hands. Fan Xian sat back down in the chair. He looked at Fan Xian and shook his head for a moment. He was so shocked he couldn't speak. As a man of the Qing kingdom, how could he hate war so much? Fortunately, he knew how many times Fan Xian had experienced life and death situations in his life. He was not a person who craved life and feared death. This idea is not absurd, Li Hongqing said each word clearly. Rather, it cannot even be considered an idea. Fan Xian raised his head and said fiercely, "Why not? If I can use my own power to unify the world, why would the Emperor need to go to war and let tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, or even tens of millions of common people die for this glorious goal? For the sake of so many lives, why can't I think like this?" Fine, fine, fine. Li Hongqing nodded his head repeatedly. You can think like this, but you will never be able to do it. Furthermore, I advise you not to let the Emperor know of your thoughts. Otherwise, he will certainly think you are crazy. I have been crazy to begin with. Fan Xian closed his eyes and faintly said, "You don't know how I've lived these 2 years. Every day, I think about this problem. It seems that in the next moment, a great battle will erupt. Those common people who don't understand anything will die under horses or under knives and spears. I want to change all of this, but I don't know how to do it. No one can help me. No one can help me." He suddenly became angry. Opening his eyes, he stared at Li Hongqing and extended a finger. In a loud voice, he said, "They've all left. Chen Pingping doesn't care anymore. Father has retired. Lin Ruofu has been scared into an old rabbit by the Emperor in Wuzhou. And the boss? He'd probably be happy to go to war and not stay in Jingdou. Uncle Wu Zhu had also left. It was only him," Fan Xian added in his heart. "It's only me." Fan Xian's lips trembled slightly. He gritted his teeth and said fiercely, "It's only me who thinks and struggles at night. I am not satisfied. I know that this is a difficult goal to reach, but I still have to try." Absurd. Laughable. Childish. Li Hongqing shook his shoulder as if he wanted to shake this madman awake. The Emperor used 30 years of time to create such a wonderful situation. She who? If the emperor is prepared, he can beat them into trash at any time. In the current situation, you want to go against His Majesty? Let me tell you, the emperor doesn't need you to do these things for him. He has enough power to do it himself. Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian like he was looking at an idiot. In these 2 years, you had the Overwatch Council purposely reduce its power in order to stabilize the court. You allowed the palace treasury to regain its former glory, replenished the national treasury, and replenished military expenses. If you truly helped him pacify Shihu and take back Dongyi, you would have already made all the preparations for the emperor before a great battle. Yet, you want the emperor to give up on the idea of starting a war at this time? Do you think the emperor is crazy, or are you crazy? What exactly happened? What has happened to you these 2 years? Li Hongqing looked at Fan Xian in disbelief. The world is at peace? This sort of thing has never happened before. At least while I am alive, I hope for world peace. This can be considered my life's dream. Fan Xian smiled self-mockingly. After a moment of silence, he said seriously, ever since I was young in Danzhou, I had always thought about what I wanted to do in this life. Later on, I gradually understood that if the world could be at peace, that would be for the best. 2 years ago in Jingdou. Fan Xian raised his head and looked at Li Hongqing's closely bearded and concerned eyes. Faintly, he said, I watched the second prince vomit blood and die, the eldest princess stab herself to death, and so many rebel soldiers, imperial soldiers, and subordinates of the Overwatch Council. Because of the goal of unifying the world, they became sacrifices on the emperor's path. It was at that time that I solidified this dream. Is it laughable? I've also seen dead people. Li Hongqing glared at him. In these 3 years on the grasslands, I've seen more dead people than you, but what can I do? History is always like this. Your dream has always been laughable, do you know that? A laughable dream is still a dream. Fan Xian crossed his hands in front of his chest and recovered his calm. Quietly, he said, if a person doesn't have a dream, then what difference is there between them and a salted fish? In the entire Qing kingdom, no one will support your so-called dream. Li Hongqing gradually calmed down. He shook his head and said with pity, including Director Chen and Minister Fan, no one will support your thoughts. I understand, Fan Xian said. I have always been different from most people in the world. I just want to use facts to convince the emperor. The emperor will never be convinced by others. Li Hongqing emphasized his tone. Who knows what hasn't happened? Fan Xian stood up. Don't forget, I am now the father of 2 children. You will have to get married and have children in these 2 years. We have to leave something for our descendants. At least, I hope it won't be a chaotic world filled with endless war and corpses. You don't think the emperor will unify the world? Li Hongqing asked after a long silence after hearing Fan Xian's words. It is easy to conquer the world, but difficult to rule it. Fan Xian tidied up his messy clothes and slowly said, back then, the northern expedition broke up the Wei kingdom and allowed the Zhan family to inherit the throne. The people of Jiangnan, Jiangbei, Shandong, and Yanjing easily submitted, but the people of the Wei kingdom will not so easily lower their heads. Even if the Iron Riders of the Qing kingdom break into Shangjing, it will take decades for the people to acknowledge the rule of the Li royal family. Accurately speaking, it will take decades of suppression and slaughter. Fan Xian walked toward the outside of the room. I don't want Xiaohua and Liangzi to not see the beautiful scenery of West Lake and the East Sea, but instead see blood flowing and iron chains crossing the river. Thus, I want to try to change it, at least in a different way. But decades of blood and iron can be exchanged for 10,000 years of peace. Li Hongqing still could not accept Fan Xian's way of thinking. The situation of the world will unite after a long time and separate after a long time. Unifying the world may bring more benefits to the people, but I can't think that far ahead, Fan Xian said. I once said this to Yen Bingyun. I can only think about the moment I am alive and the moment my children are alive. I just don't want to be a salted fish. I don't want to be a saint. After saying this, Fan Xian walked out of the room. Inside the room, Li Hongqing's palms pressed against the map and suddenly said, "Why are you telling me this?" Fan Xian didn't turn around. He smiled and replied, "We are friends. I won't hide my thoughts from my friends." Then, he thought of his friend in the flowery dress. His heart throbbed with pain. A few days later, the imperial envoy of Xiliang Road, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, and the Duke of Danbua, Fan Xian, entered the city to patrol on behalf of the emperor. The governor of Xiliang Road and the general came out of the city to welcome him. The entire city celebrated for 3 days. At the end of the 3 days, the general's manor investigated the case of the spies in the mutton shop. They found that Jiangnan merchants had secretly colluded with Hu bandits and smuggled salt and iron. A total of 14 people were executed. After the banquet, the imperial envoy left the city to send him off. On the same day, the imperial envoy, Fan Xian, had already disguised himself as a merchant and boarded a carriage headed toward Qingzhou, beginning his journey to investigate the case. Just as he had said to Li Hongqing that night, he had to calm the situation in Shi Lake and peacefully subdue Dongyi before the world went to war. Only then could he prove his ability to the emperor and the feasibility of his methods. However, this trip to Shi Lake was not only a step for Fan Xian to break away from his salted fish life. More importantly, he was going to resolve a matter that made him very angry. This matter could not be explained clearly to Hongqing. The carriage moved forward on the road between the boundless fields. In front and behind the carriages, Overwatch Council subordinates were watching everything cautiously to prevent the Hu people's grass-clearing troops from suddenly attacking. Fan Xian hoped that a small group of Hu people would come. Unfortunately, after that night, Li Hongqing had first launched the autumn attack in the 9th year of the Qing calendar. In an instant, the Shi Lake riders had killed their way back to the foot of Tianshan. On the grasslands, the empty rear of Qingzhou immediately became quiet. Fan Xian drew back his gaze from outside the window. He knew that the large movements of the western camp were completely to ensure his safety. Although Hongqing had not said it explicitly, he was using his actions to help him. His gaze landed on a knife in his hand. The style of this knife was normal, but it was made of very good material. It was definitely not something the Hu people's level of craftsmanship could make. The problem was, this knife was the Hu weapon they had seized from Qingzhou 5 months ago. The officials of the 4th Bureau in Qingzhou had cautiously sent this knife back to Jingdou and presented it in front of Fan Xian's eyes. This knife did not have any markings that could be used to investigate its origins, but Fan Xian recognized it at a glance because this kind of knife was made by a secret workshop on the side of the North Sea. Fan Xian's eyes were filled with a fire of anger that was difficult to suppress. The Jinqi in his body released and, with a crack, snapped the knife in two. Chapter 601. The journey was peaceful. The group of carriages moved forward on the official road. Occasionally, they could find the traces of the Hu people's bloody surprise attacks. Every time this happened, Fan Xian would get out of the carriage and look for a while. Then, he would have his subordinate 2nd Bureau intelligence officers carefully gather all kinds of information. Stopping and walking like this, it only took them 6 days to arrive at the most remote and shortest-lived city in the Qing kingdom, Qingzhou. Qingzhou was very different from what Fan Xian had imagined. Before coming here, he had carefully looked at the intelligence reports in the council and had even specifically asked the Great Prince about the specific situation on the Western Front. He had thought that Qingzhou was just a rather desolate and run-down border city, more like a heavily guarded military camp. Unexpectedly, when his group entered the city, they found that other than the soldiers walking back and forth, most of the people in the city were merchants. Merchants like Fan Xian walked through the few remaining streets and alleys in Qingzhou with hurried expressions. They hurried to exchange documents for exiting the border. In a loud voice, they called for hard labor and carefully stared at the goods they had brought to the border. All of this made Qingzhou lose some of its iron and blood color. Instead, it gained the rich smell of money. It appeared particularly messy. Fan Xian had thought that the court had set up a province here mainly for symbolic meaning. Qingzhou would be particularly small and dry. He had not thought that this place would have the feeling of a little Suzhou. He sat on the shaft of the carriage and looked at the scene in front of him with a pained smile. He didn't know what to say. Speaking of which, Qingzhou's abnormal prosperity was inextricably linked to Fan Xian. In the small city, most of the brave merchants who were busy entering the grasslands came from Jiangnan. The Qing court had always strictly prohibited trading with the Hu people. 3 years ago, Fan Xian had remonstrated with the emperor and secretly relaxed this rule. Salt, iron, and grain were strictly prohibited from being sold to the Hu people. But, what was there to be afraid of selling luxury goods like jewelry, perfume, and strong alcohol to the Hu people? For one, it could bring a lot of income to the Qing national treasury because the nobles in the Hu tribes, who controlled more than 90% of the wealth, greatly welcomed these things. For another, it made it easier to send spies into the grasslands. Fan Xian had seen this in the past, but he had not personally come to Qingzhou. He indeed did not know that one thought of his had allowed Qingzhou to develop so quickly in just a few short years. It had already surpassed his imagination. It looked like they could earn the Hu people's gems, good horses, and blankets by using some small things that were not particularly valuable. Such a large profit made the Qing merchants extremely excited. They were willing to risk the danger of the two sides fighting endlessly and go deep into the grasslands to trade. Marx's words were very good, Fan Xian thought. He also had a plan in his heart. Since there were so many people covering for him, he should still be able to go to the grasslands. The border army stationed in Green Province was especially strict towards these merchants. Even though those merchant companies vigorously stuffed banknotes into the officers' hands, they still didn't speed up the inspection. Fan Xian and his group waited at the city gate for a long time but found it difficult to move forward. The autumn sun hung in the sky above the grasslands. It was a blazing white. Although it did not give the merchants and soldiers in the city too much of a test of heat, this kind of brightness made people's emotions begin to become irritated. After all, Qingzhou was too special. It was a strange city formed by soldiers and traveling merchants. When the soldiers became irritated, their attitude toward the merchants became much worse. Although the merchants' emotions were similarly irritated, they still lowered their heads and smiled obsequiously. Until today, the soldiers of the western camp still could not understand why the imperial court would allow these greedy bastards to pass through Qingzhou and enter the grasslands to curry favor with their mortal enemies, the Hu people. As they sent out the documents, they were cursing in their hearts with ill intentions. They hoped that these shameless bastards who did not care about their lives for money would die on the grasslands under the arrows of the Hu people and never come back. Outside the inspection yamen, there were a few black-robed Overwatch Council officials sitting beside the officers and supervising the inspection of goods. Fan Xian gave Mu Feng a meaningful glance. Mu Feng immediately understood his meaning and began to prepare to secretly make contact with these colleagues of the Fourth Bureau. After arranging everything, Fan Xian impatiently continued to wait in the carriages. He jumped off the shaft of the carriage and patted the dust off his bottom. Leading a subordinate disguised as a servant, he walked into Qingzhou. He pulled open his collar and raised his head to look at the white sun that had shrunk into a small circle in the sky with narrowed eyes. He also felt irritated in his heart, but he didn't sweat. He was very upset. Suddenly, the Qingzhou city gate not far behind him suddenly opened. A series of urgent and orderly horse hooves rang out outside the city gate, startling the long line of merchants waiting to inspect the goods. Everyone looked toward the city gate with curiosity. They didn't know which troop had returned. The troops returning at this time should have been out hunting rabbits on the grasslands after not returning all night. Hunting rabbits was a slang on the border. It had the same meaning as the Hu people's so-called gathering grass and grain. The Qing kingdom and Shi who had continuously stabbed at each other. They relied on this kind of sweeping and counter-sweeping to maintain the blood hatred between them. Although the Qing army was powerful, the troops that dared to leave the city to fight in the middle of the night still appeared very courageous. Fan Xian also heard the dense sound of horse hooves. He pulled his gaze back from the sky and looked toward the city gate. Perhaps it was because the sun in the sky was too hot that it left a burning white mark on his retina. When he gazed at the group of weather-beaten riders outside the city gate, particularly the general at the very front of the riders, it was like he was looking at the sun. The general leading the riders bravely attacking the grasslands at night was not tall. Contrasted by the armor, she appeared slightly thin and small. However, Fan Xian felt that her body was suffused with light. Especially the pair of eyes under her eyebrows that were as dark as the distant mountains. Her eyes were still very bright, so bright that there was not a trace of impurity. They were like jade reflecting the sunlight. However, her brows were furrowed. It seemed that she was thinking more than many years ago. The armor on her body was stained with blood. The horse beneath her was very tired. It looked like she had experienced a true battle last night. As if pierced by that pair of clean eyes, Fan Xian closed his eyes and lowered his head, hoping that she had not discovered him. A strange feeling welled up in his heart. This scene seemed to prove that something like time did not just advance in one direction. 5 years ago, Fan Xian had come to Jingdou from Danzhou. Outside the city gate, he had seen this girl with brows like distant mountains and eyes like jade. However, the girl who had called him teacher back then wore a light-colored dress and a playful white deerskin hat. Today, the girl was wearing a dusty military uniform and had an awe-inspiring aura. Time had changed many people and changed many people. It seemed that the only thing that did not change was their names. Fan Xian lowered his head deeply and used his subordinate's body to hide his figure. On the horse, Yi Ling was clearly tired. She did not notice that there were old acquaintances among the merchants on the side of the street. When the merchants realized that the leader of the riders was Yi Ling, they withdrew their gazes. These merchants, who had come to Qingzhou for many years, were already used to this scene. Since it was the young lady of the Yi family who led the troops out of the city, regardless of whether it was night or day, she would have to kill some Hu people before she was willing to return to the city. 2 years had passed since the Jingdou rebellion. The emperor was grateful for the Yi family's loyalty and gave a special edict to take away Yi Ling's title of Wangfei. In reality, he was silently allowing this girl to remarry. In the old territory of the Dingzhou army, all of the soldiers and commoners were used to calling this girl who had returned home Lady Yi. No one was used to calling her Wangfei. However, Yi Ling stubbornly called herself Wangfei. It was only a year ago that she had taken a knife and forced Li Hongqing to send her to Qingzhou. Fan Xian watched the thin figure on the horse gradually move further and further away. He was silent. He knew very well about Yi Ling's life these 2 years in Dingzhou and Qingzhou. He also understood why Yi Ling persisted in calling herself Wangfei and why Yi Ling wore a suit of armor. Perhaps it was only on the grasslands when she brandished a sword that she would forget the unhappy past. The environment of the grasslands and a life of iron and blood were indeed the best ways to make a person strong. The daughter of the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, the daughter of the person in charge of the Qing kingdom's military, was fighting head-on with the enemy on the most dangerous frontier. This was probably something that had never happened before in history. Because of this drama, what Yi Ling received was no longer just sympathetic gazes and rumors, but respect and fear. Fan Xian was not worried about Yi Ling's safety because Li Hongqing would certainly not let Yi Ling sink into a dangerous situation. The people on both sides of the frontier all had a natural respect for the Yi family. The riders Yi Ling led were certainly the elite of the Qing army. Yi Ling had the strength of a 7th-level martial artist. It was enough to protect herself. Most importantly, this path of forgetting had been chosen by Yi Ling herself. Fan Xian greatly respected this. With great difficulty, Mu Feng exchanged for the document to leave the frontier. After being pulled by the Qingzhou military and reprimanded by the ear and endlessly intimidated by the dangers of the Hu people on the grasslands, he finally completed all the necessary procedures with a helpless expression. The goods were gathered in the Qingzhou Yamen. When they left the city and entered the grasslands, they would have to use the pass in their hands to pick them up. This was also because they were afraid that after the goods were inspected, some people would secretly tamper with them. Smuggling such things was rampant no matter which frontier it was. Some military officers would even bring in small groups. However, the Dingzhou general's manner turned a blind eye to this matter. Qingzhou was isolated on the edge of the grasslands. Life was unspeakably bitter. If there wasn't some outside money, no military officer would be willing to stay here for a long time. That night, Fan Xian and his group rested in a large shared bed. The entire large room was filled with the stench of feet. The night was bone-chilling. Fan Xian used his privilege to sleep against the wall. Although it was the coldest, it was also the quietest. Mu Feng lay beside him and repeatedly asked for forgiveness in a quiet voice. Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. In everyone's eyes, he was a descendant of the heavens. Not many people knew what kind of hardship he had suffered in his 2 lives. When it came to enduring hardship, everyone underestimated him. The night grew darker. A few strange movements came from outside the shared bed. Mu Feng, who had not slept, immediately woke up and prepared to inform Sir Fan Jr. Unexpectedly, when he turned his face, he saw Fan Xian's bright and calm eyes shining with light in the night. Like a wolf. The two of them quietly rose and met with the official of the 4th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. It was the clever person who had secretly sent the knife to Jingdo. In a dark corner of the courtyard, Fan Xian lowered his voice and asked the official, "How many of these knives are there?" "Just this one," the official quickly replied. "Originally, there were 3, but after I took one, I found that the other 2 were gone the next day." Fan Xian's heart chilled. Could it be? The official knew what he meant and shook his head. "It's not from the Western University. These spoils of war are not eye-catching. They are all piled up in the warehouse and no one notices. As for those 2 knives, they should have been stolen by someone. I'm not sure who stole it." "You didn't watch that night?" Fan Xian stared into the official's eyes. The official raised his head and replied in a small voice, "I watched all night and didn't find anything." He paused and then said, "If someone could steal a knife in front of me, it must be an ace." For some reason, Fan Xian trusted this subordinate's confident judgment. He smiled and asked, "How high?" "As high as the 9th level," the subordinate replied cutely. After a few words, Fan Xian found that he liked this 4th Bureau official whose name he didn't know very much. He didn't know where this liking came from. He glanced at the official curiously and didn't say anything. He thought to himself that the 9th-level disciples under heaven were all famous and powerful figures. How could a 9th level appear in this remote Qingzhou? Although liking was liking, Fan Xian's eyes under his slightly lowered eyelids became icy. His fingers bent slightly, ready to strike and kill the official in front of him at any moment. "One last question. Why are you so interested in this knife?" The knife that had been broken in the carriage had a very common style. If Fan Xian had not been very familiar with the material used to make the knife, he would not have discovered the hidden danger within. The 4th Bureau official did not feel Fan Xian's hidden but unreleased killing intent. Very respectfully, he said, "Sir, I am a member of the Qinian unit." The official knelt on one knee and presented an item with both hands. Fan Xian accepted the item and slowly stroked it in his palm. His heart was empty. This was the token of his most loyal subordinate. However, he truly knew nothing about this official's existence. He confirmed the other's identity and no longer had any doubts. He nodded his head. The official stood and said in a low voice, "I was personally chosen by Sir Wang to join the team. However, I have never stood out. A few years ago, I had been in the 3 large workshops. At the beginning of this year, I was moved to Qingzhou. Looking at this knife, I felt it was strange because this knife embryo should be a Type B steel from the 3rd large workshop. In the past, the weapons produced by the palace treasury may have been lost on the battlefield, but this kind of knife has not been distributed to the military. I felt the situation was urgent, so I quickly informed you." Fan Xian nodded and took a deep breath. He knew his good luck was still continuing. However, he didn't know who the 9th-level ace who had stolen the 2 knives was. He secretly deduced that if that person was his enemy, the court would probably be full of words attacking him for treason by now. Since the court was quiet, it meant that the person who had stolen the knives also wanted to help him cover up. "So, you were personally chosen by Lao Wang." In the darkness, Fan Xian smiled. It was impossible to see that his smile was slightly twisted. "No wonder your words are so interesting." Fan Xian opened his mouth again and said, "Concerning the name Songji Xianling, have you found anything?" The official stood and reported seriously, "There have indeed been a few more outsiders in the Hu King's camp these 2 years, but there is no Songji Xianling. I have no leads." Fan Xian said. "I have already had the 2nd Bureau investigate this name. Wait here. Once there is news, immediately send someone into the grasslands to inform me." "You are going to the grasslands?" "I am going to find the person who stole the knives." Fan Xian's voice was very cold. Immediately after, it softened. He patted the official's shoulder and said, "You did well this time. After you finish investigating this case, return to the capital to help me. Thank you for your promotion." The official was overjoyed and knelt down to accept the order. He lowered his voice but could not suppress his joy. "I haven't seen Sir Wang in 2 years. I wonder if he is well." Concerning Wang Qinyan's whereabouts, Fan Xian had never made it clear to the officials in the council. Everyone, including Yan Bingyun and the others, thought that Lao Wang had gone to carry out the commissioner's secret mission. No one suspected anything. The Overwatch Council officials on the periphery knew even less. Hearing these words, Fan Xian was silent. He thought to himself, "Wang Qinyan, that old bastard. He has already left, yet he continues to help me. How could I not miss him?" The opening ceremony of the Paralympics last night was very good. If there are friends who didn't watch it, it would be best to watch the replay. Otherwise, it would be a pity. Another thing, yesterday, I watched Zhang Xiaohua's first chaos in history. I've been nurturing him for a few months. After watching it all in one go, I almost laughed my head off. Talent is talent, this is rare. Speaking of which, why does 6th Lu's surname just happen to be Lu? His words were too biased, too biased. Chapter 602. 2 days later, Fan Xian and his group prepared to leave Qingzhou. This trip required them to go deep into the grasslands, so it was not convenient to ride in carriages. Other than carts carrying goods, the rest of the merchants all traveled on horseback. During these 2 days, Mu Feng had already naturally established a good relationship with the merchants and agreed on a journey. Early that morning, when large numbers of merchant groups began to leave the city, the Qingzhou riders, who had once again left the city to hunt rabbits, just happened to be returning to the city. The 2 groups brushed past each other. The riders did not look directly at these merchants. Although their superiors would sometimes send these riders to escort these merchants, most of the time, the 2 sides rarely interacted. Without the Qing army escorting them, perhaps these merchants would be safer. Yi Ling, with a tired expression, sat on her horse. A few strands of black hair leaked out of her helmet and mixed with her sweat. It was sticky. She used her finger to play with it. Her gaze unconsciously flickered to the merchant group outside the city gate. It was just a glance, but it was like she was attracted by a magnet. Yi Ling furrowed her brows and looked suspiciously at a young merchant standing next to a horse in the caravan. The merchant wore a cotton robe. It was ordinary and did not appear to be eye-catching, but Yi Ling felt that it was a little strange. From this angle, she could only see the young merchant's back. It was this back that allowed Yi Ling to discover his true identity. Her expression suddenly changed. A complicated emotion flashed through her eyes. It was Fan Xian. How could Yi Ling so easily discover Fan Xian's figure? Because Fan Xian was her teacher, he had once taught her little tricks for a year. Yi Ling had also taught him the Yi family's coffin breaker without holding anything back. Their palms crossed and their bodies fought. They were familiar with each other's movements, habits, and body characteristics to a terrifying degree. Yi Ling stared in a daze at the figure's back. Biting her lip, she suppressed her emotions. She did not ride forward. Instead, she cracked her whip, called out to her teacher, and cried loudly. She knew that since Fan Xian had come to Qingzhou in disguise and had not come to see her, then it was certainly not a private matter. Rather, it was an important mission for the court. The Overwatch Council wanted to make some noise on the grasslands. If it was not an important matter, a noble's son like Fan Xian would not take such a big risk and enter deep into the grasslands. Yi Ling was no longer the spirited little girl of the past. She had matured a great deal. She would not expose Fan Xian's identity in front of everyone. She only glanced deeply at his back and then silently led her horse toward the manor. After entering the government, she didn't even rest for a moment before she said, "A few days ago, the Dingzhou general's manor gave the order for the autumn hunt. It is time for us to make some moves." A general who was listening at the side felt a chill in his heart. He thought to himself that Miss was getting more and more ruthless. It was just that they had launched an attack in the middle of the night, and their men and horses were already exhausted. He explained, "The great general's orders are clear. Qing province is not within the scope of this autumn hunt. Then we'll make it ourselves." Yi Ling lowered her head. She was no longer a little girl who had come to play, but a female general with a lot of experience. Add to that her identity and background, and the words she spoke, even her immediate superior had to consider them seriously. No one knew why Yi Ling insisted on the Qingzhou army joining the scope of the autumn hunt. No one knew that the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, had come to Qingzhou, left Qingzhou, and entered the grasslands. Yi Ling's suggestion was to use the Qingzhou riders to attract most of the Hu people's attention and protect the safety of the merchant group along the way. There have been especially many merchants this year. No one knows if the Hu people will suddenly go crazy. The nobles of the Hu tribe are still counting on the merchants to bring in an endless stream of goods. How could they go crazy? The general thought to himself and furrowed his brows. Don't worry about those merchants. If we send out troops, I'm afraid it will make things more inconvenient for them. Yi Ling didn't say anything. She lowered her head and thought that if the 3 roads into the grasslands were thrown into chaos, it should make it easier for Fan Xian to do things. Although she didn't know why Fan Xian had risked his life to enter the grasslands, she only knew one thing. Her teacher had always been the best at obtaining the greatest benefit from chaos. During these 2 or 3 days, there were suddenly many outsiders in the Dingzhou headquarters behind Qingzhou. Some of these people used the identities of court officials and said they were there to check on the expenditure. Some were merchants from various places. There were also hard laborers who had come to the west to make a fortune while the war was about to end. These people's identities were very messy, so they didn't attract much attention. They were only faintly divided into many small groups. There was a leader in each group. Just as Fan Xian's group left Qingzhou and began to head toward the grasslands king's tent in search of Songji Xianling, these leaders quietly entered the general's manor. There was an important matter in the general's manor, so all the unrelated people had been chased out of the manor. Looking at the dozen or so people in different clothing below the hall, General Li Hongqing couldn't help but smile bitterly and say, Fan Xian's spending this time is quite large. The people who had entered Dingzhou were all officials and secret agents of the Overwatch Council. At this moment, in the general's manor were the heads of each department. Only one person had the right to sit in the chair below the hall. This person was already middle-aged. His hair had not yet turned white, but his gaze was tired. It looked like these 3 years in a foreign country had been unusually difficult. This person looked at Li Hongqing and bowed. The council thinks that if we want to clear out the spies in Dingzhou, we must use thunderous methods. Li Hongqing looked at this person and furrowed his brows. But, we can't have you come personally. Deng Ziyu, you're not in Shangjing. You've suddenly come to Dingzhou. What about the court's matters in the north? Li Hongqing's status was noble, but he spoke more politely to this middle-aged man because he knew he was the head of the Overwatch Council spies in northern Qi. His more important identity was the head of the Qinian unit and one of Fan Xian's most capable trusted aides. This Overwatch Council official in charge of Dingzhou's elimination of spies was Deng Ziyu, who Fan Xian had sent to northern Qi for more than 2 years. No one knew what went wrong with the mission this time for Fan Xian to bring him back. If I don't come back myself, how can I capture those people? Deng Ziyu thought to himself, but he didn't say it out loud to the crown prince. This matter not only involved the battle between Shihu and the Qing kingdom, but it also involved another powerful power. Fan Xian had moved him south with no intention of having him return to Shangjing. He wanted to use his 3 years of infiltration of the northern Qi brocade guards in Shangjing, as well as his familiarity with northern Qi. After finishing this matter, I won't return to Shangjing. Deng Ziyu bowed respectfully to Li Hongqing. Li Hongqing looked into his eyes and slowly said, how will the western camp cooperate? Deng Ziyu should have been in Dingzhou for 3 days. Fan Xian sat on the horse with his eyes half closed. It seemed that he was not worried at all that the horse would throw him off. He yawned and said, according to the agreed time, we have to be fast. Otherwise, if they attack in Dingzhou and anger the people on the grasslands, I'm afraid it won't be appropriate. He had been preparing for this matter for 4 months. If the anger in his heart had not accumulated to such a strong degree, perhaps Fan Xian would not have used such crude methods. However, he also knew that the other party had entered the grasslands long before him. Their infiltration of Dingzhou had already been going on for over a year. He was already much slower in terms of time. If he couldn't delay the other party's commander on the grasslands, something might go wrong. Mu Feng glanced at Fan Xian and then at the long line of merchants in front of him. Furrowing his brows, he said, these people move too slowly. Furthermore, they will stop at each tribe along the way. If we really walk to the king's tent, who knows how long it will take. According to the original plan, Fan Xian's group of merchants should have separated from the main group of merchants yesterday. There had been a fork in the grasslands yesterday. Hu Ge should have sent his trusted aide there to receive them. Then, Fan Xian's group would take a shortcut and reach their destination. Unexpectedly, there was no one at the fork in the road to receive them. It was only one of Hu Ji's trusted aides who had found an opening and sneaked into the tent at night to express his apologies and explain the reason. The other 2 roads on the grasslands were being attacked by the Qingzhou army. As the foremost ace under the left virtuous king's banner, Hu Ge just so happened to be there with his subordinates. Naturally, he had been moved to provide support. It was impossible for him to leave the majority of the group to receive the Qing Kingdom's Overwatch Council. Fan Xian didn't know this was Yi Ling's intention. He had not thought that his female disciple wanted to share his burden and instead brought him even more trouble. Since that person still hasn't shown himself, even if we get to the king's tent, we won't see him. Mu Feng looked at Fan Xian and reminded him. The other party won't make such a mistake. He knows it is a merchant group from the Qing kingdom. He won't show himself in front of us. The horses slowly moved forward. Their hooves stepped on the autumn grass. Dingzhou is ready, Mu Feng reminded again. Mu Feng reminded again. In his opinion, even if there were so-called aces in the Hu King's tent, as long as they caught all the spies in Dingzhou, the other party would not be able to raise too many waves. Why take the risk? Fan Xian's thumb gently moved on the reins. A moment later, he said, I have to know who that person is. This is a very important point. If the other party is who I think they are, then I have to change my tactics. Just catching everyone in Dingzhou in one fell swoop will not have a fundamental effect. He had never heard of the name Songji Xianling, nor did he know what this name meant in the Hu language. But almost subconsciously, he thought that the person with this name was a woman. This was an unreasonable inference. It was somewhat mysterious and did not make sense. Fan Xian believed more and more in his deduction and became more and more angry. In the distance, there were a few white birds flying quickly on the knee-high grasslands. Fan Xian raised his eyes and looked. He could faintly see that behind the grasslands in the distance was a vast desert. What was further away from the desert? To the east of the desert is the North Sea. Mu Feng looked at his slightly furrowed brows and knew what he was thinking. In a quiet voice, he said, beyond the vast North Sea is northern Qi. I've been to the North Sea. Fan Xian looked in that direction as if he wanted to see the reeds in the North Sea. Faintly, he said, this desert stretches for thousands of li. It is said that no one can pass through it alive. Although the North Sea is beautiful, it is boundless. If one wishes to cross it, it is extremely difficult. I've been thinking about this problem. How exactly should one go from northern Qi to Shihu? First head south into the border of the country. Then, from northwest of Jingdou, head straight for Dingzhou, and then Qingzhou into the grasslands. That is where we are now. Mu Feng had clearly put in a lot of effort in Jingdou. It will take a long time, but it is convenient. Compared to forcefully crossing the North Sea and passing through the desert, it is more feasible. But, the Shihu king's tent and the two virtuous kings would never trust a Central Plains person from the Qing kingdom, Fan Xian said with a cold expression. Fan Xian said with a cold expression, to win the trust of the seemingly warm but actually overly suspicious Hu people is a difficult task in itself, so I am very curious as to how they did it. In the next dozen days, the merchant group advanced deeper into the grasslands. Everywhere was a scene of autumn grass. Occasionally, they saw nomadic herders grazing hundreds of cows and sheep. They were like white clouds floating above the gently rising and falling meadows. It was beautiful and peaceful. This place was no longer the place where the Shihu and Qing armies fought, so it gradually gave off the feeling of a paradise beyond the Great Wall. Along the way, they passed through two large tribes. The Qing merchants had sold a lot of goods. The entire merchant group appeared much lighter, and their speed also increased. However, there were still no merchants who finished selling their goods and retraced their steps back. The most valuable goods were the lighter. Furthermore, if they wanted to sell them for a high price, they could only go to the Hu King's tent. Along the way, Fan Xian carefully paid attention to the Hu people's attitude toward his merchant group because this involved a very important matter in the future. He self-mockingly found that the gaze the Hu people used to look at the Central Plains merchants was still somewhat unfriendly and even contained a bone-deep hatred. The blood debt of thousands of years could not be washed away with gems and tea. However, the leaders of the tribes, the priests, and the nobles had a much better attitude toward the Central Plains merchants. Through Mu Feng's careful questioning, he learned from the mouths of the people in the old merchant groups that this change in attitude had only begun a year ago. It seemed that the Shihu king's tent finally understood the importance of trade and had given orders to the various tribes to strictly forbid them from harassing the merchant groups entering the grasslands. In some dangerous areas, they were even responsible for sending out the elites of the tribes to protect and escort these merchant groups. A year ago, there was a poor little tribe that could not resist the temptation of the Central Plains merchants. They secretly attacked and stole a lot of goods, angering the king's tent. He directly sent out soldiers to exterminate them, or rather, slaughter them. Not a single person from the small tribe survived. It was also this bloody example that made everyone on the grasslands understand the determination of the king's tent. It also ensured the safety of the Central Plains trading caravans. From then on, even though they still faced some hostile gazes on the grasslands, the Central Plains merchants no longer faced any dangerous swords or sabers. This was a long-term plan. Fan Xian secretly admired it. He knew that although the merchant groups were only selling some luxury goods, there was no life without trade. As long as the merchants on the grasslands were guaranteed to be unobstructed, who knew if the merchants of the Qin Kingdom, Dongyi, and Northern Qi would secretly disregard the Qin Kingdom's ban and secretly send daily and military supplies into the grasslands for the sake of profit. If this went on and the border was relaxed, the power of the Hu people would grow day by day. That day, the king's tent finally arrived. Looking at the crescent sea at the foot of the lonely mountain, the small desert beside the sea, and the large green grasslands, Fan Xian was slightly dazed by the beautiful scenery. The location of the king's tent was indeed different from other places. There was a different layout between heaven and earth. In particular, the green grasslands made Fan Xian feel strange. It was autumn, so why was the grass still green? On the side of the lonely mountain, countless cows and sheep were scattered across the wide grasslands. The young women of the Hu tribe were washing pots and utensils by the crescent sea, preparing to welcome the guests from the Central Plains. It was quiet. The sky here seemed to be much lower than in other places. It almost touched the ground of the grasslands. The autumn wind blew slightly and the grass bent low. It was very refreshing. Fan Xian dismounted and glanced at a normal Overwatch Council official behind him. He smiled and turned his head. Looking at the beautiful scene in front of him, he couldn't help but shake his head. After a while, the king would personally host a banquet to entertain these esteemed guests. The Western Lake man led the Central Plain merchants to a tent on the shore of the Crescent Sea and had them rest. After a while, the king would personally host a banquet to entertain these honored guests. This group of merchants was probably the largest group of merchants this autumn, so the king's tent was very attentive in entertaining them. However, Fan Xian still felt it was strange. The Western Hu people's attitude seemed to be overly good. Did that Songji Xianling really have such a deep influence on the king's tent? After eating some food, Fan Xian rubbed his stomach and walked out of the tent. Walking to the meadow by the Crescent Sea, he narrowed his eyes and looked at the surrounding scenery. His current identity was that of a merchant. Other than not being able to spy on the king's tent, the Western Hu did not forbid these Central Plains merchants from wandering around. No one on the grasslands knew him, so there was no need to worry about his safety. His mood also lightened. The sky is vast, the wilderness is boundless. He only had time to say these words before he was interrupted by a cry of praise from beside him. Fan Xian turned his head and saw a young man walking quickly to his side and hurriedly calling out good. Chapter 603. Fan Xian looked at the young man and smiled. However, the thoughts hidden deeply in his smile were not discovered by the young man. He had stood on the meadow for a long time and watched the young man walk out of the king's tent. He waited for the young man to gradually approach the meadow before he said those 6 words. He wanted to give the young man a chance to strike up a conversation because he knew that the young man who had walked out of the king's tent would want to speak with the merchants of the Central Plains. Striking up a conversation was one of Fan Xian's best skills. Back in the day, the northern Chi Saint girl Haitang had also lost to his skill of the tongue, much less this young man. Of course. The young man chuckled. Although it was only 6 words, the aura of the grasslands was immediately forced out by them. This was an excuse. It was an excuse that the young man, who had been lonely on the grasslands for a long time and urgently needed to chat with someone from the Central Plains to relieve his homesickness, had found. His long years of working as a special agent of the Overwatch Council allowed Fan Xian to quickly make a decision in such a short amount of time. The young man's appearance was clearly not that of a Hu person, but he had walked out of the king's tent. He must have some connection to the person he was searching for, which was why he had acted. Someone from the Central Plains? Fan Xian looked at him suspiciously and asked, "I didn't see you in the merchant group. When I came back last time, there were some goods I didn't sell. The king treats us guests very well, so I stayed behind to see if there were any benefits." It was clear that this young man was not an expert liar. Fan Xian heard some problems in his tone. "This is my first time here." Fan Xian chuckled and pointed at the crescent sea and grasslands in front of him. "I didn't expect the scenery on the grasslands to be so enchanting. If you look at it for a long time, you'll get tired of it," the young man said with a pained smile. "Oh? I just got here today and haven't gotten tired of it yet." "How long have you been here?" Fan Xian asked curiously. "Everyone says that the Hu people are barbaric. Aren't you afraid that they'll suddenly go crazy?" After his disguise, Fan Xian had a handsome and sincere face. Additionally, his relaxed tone and sincere attitude made it easy for him to gain the trust of others. His conversation with the young man continued very naturally. This young man's surname was Wei Wucheng, which was probably a fake name. According to him, he was also one of the businessmen who came to the prairie, but he was forced to stay in the prairie. He had been here for more than 3 months. However, Fan Xian already had a plan in his heart. He would not believe these excuses. If they were merchants, how could they so easily enter and exit the king's tent? To deal with the homesick young man with sincerity, he easily got some information out of him by using the treachery in his sincerity. The young man's attire and the worn Hu leather boots revealed that he had spent a long time on the steppe. Through these conversations, Fan Xian obtained a lot of useful information. For example, there should be more than one young person from the Central Plain who had stayed in the Crescent Sea King's tent. There were at least 10 people who had stayed for a long time. There were also some slight changes in the king's tent these 2 years. In the end, this is the territory of the Hu. After clearing out the goods, Brother Wei, you should return to the Central Plains. Fan Xian sincerely invited, "If you come with us, your safety will be guaranteed." Wei Wucheng paused and didn't know how to respond. Looking at the young merchant's sincere expression, he felt a bit of guilt in his heart. He didn't understand why he had talked for so long with this seemingly normal young merchant. He could feel that this conversation was very comfortable. The other party was a person worthy of trust. If Wei Wucheng's deduction got out, the entire world would probably laugh their heads off. Was the Qing Kingdom's Fan Xian someone who could be trusted? "Alright, I'll go ask the elders in the tribe," Wei Wucheng replied with a forced smile. Fan Xian was not stupid enough to directly point this out. He rose from the meadow and patted his bottom. "Brother Wei, see you tonight." At night, the Western Hu King's tent held a banquet to entertain the merchants from the Central Plain. If Wei Wucheng was truly a merchant, then they would certainly meet at the banquet. Wei Wucheng hesitated for a moment and then explained, "The banquet tonight is to entertain you. We probably won't come." Wei Wucheng doesn't have an accent, but he is certainly not a merchant. Fan Xian drank a mouthful of goat milk wine and furrowed his brows uncomfortably. He said to Mu Feng, beside him, "Furthermore, he has been on the grasslands for at least a year. There are at least a dozen people with him who can enter and leave the king's tent at will." Mu Feng glanced at him and asked in a low voice, "Is it the person we're looking for?" "It should be." Fan Xian seemed to have not expected his luck to be this good. He immediately shook his head. Wei Wucheng is not a professional spy. Otherwise, he wouldn't have made such a big mistake. I'm thinking, what exactly do these Central Plain people want to do by staying in Western Hu territory? Fan Xian put down his bowl and looked at Mu Feng. Most importantly, the person called Songji Xianling has yet to appear. Regardless of how Wei Wucheng and his group can help Western Hu, the reason the Western Hu king trusts them so much must be because of Songji Xianling. As you wish, I went to ask around, but I didn't directly say the name in fear of drawing attention, Mu Feng reported. However, during these 2 years, the chief of Western Hu has not taken a concubine. Other than his first wife, he hasn't even had a woman. Fan Xian paused for a moment. From the beginning, he had thought that Songji Xianling was a woman. That was why Mu Feng had investigated from this angle. Hearing Mu Feng's report, Fan Xian couldn't help but laugh at himself. If it really was her, how could she have become the chief's favored concubine? There's another problem, Mu Feng said seriously. I feel that Wei Wucheng's appearance was too coincidental, so coincidental that it cannot be explained. His words cannot be completely trusted. What if it is a trap or a misdirection? My target has never been the Central Plain people in the king's tent, Fan Xian said seriously. Wei Wucheng's appearance may seem coincidental to you, but I don't think it's coincidental at all. He shook his head and said, the grasslands and Central Plain are two completely different worlds. If you don't stay here for a year, you will not be able to understand those people's longing for home. Wei Wucheng is still a young man. It is difficult to suppress his homesickness. Seeing us merchants from the Central Plain, he wanted to come and talk and hear what interesting things have happened in his homeland. Could homesickness really make people so uncomfortable? Mu Feng furrowed his brows. After he had been transferred from the first bureau to the Qinian unit, he had also been sent out on missions. He didn't think it would be that bad. Seeming to guess what Mu Feng was thinking, Fan Xian said, there will always be a day when the missions are finished. However, those people from the Central Plain, or Northern Qi, who enter and leave the king's tent, they may never be able to return to their homeland. After saying this, he sank into silence. The reason he understood Wei Wucheng's thoughts so clearly was because Fan Xian understood how much emotion a wanderer who found it difficult to return to his homeland and was stranded in a foreign land would have. It was just like him. After leaving that world filled with the smell of medicine, he could never return. Although he had never thought about it, it was still difficult to suppress his longing. Even if Wei Wucheng is homesick and wants to talk to the merchants of the Central Plain, are the people in the king's tent not afraid that he will spill the beans? He is using the identity of a merchant. We are unable to go deep into the king's tent to see the proceedings of the Western Hu nobles. No one can prove anything. It was clear that Mu Feng was still worried about Wei Wucheng and the commissioner's coincidental meeting. He furrowed his brows tightly and said, I just find it strange. Since it is a casual chat, why didn't he go find the Xiong family merchants or me? Why did he come find you? Fan Xian was silent for a moment. A cute smile rose to his face. He opened his mouth and said, my meeting with Wei Wucheng was not a coincidence. When he came out of the king's tent, I was already standing on the meadow and watching his every move. Mu Feng had also seen that scene clearly. He stood at the door of the tent by the Crescent Sea and watched the commissioner stand on the meadow and look down at the grassland and lake. I am good-looking. Even if I am disguised, I am still good-looking, Fan Xian said with a smile. Furthermore, I give people a feeling that they are willing to get close to me. When I stood on the meadow, the Hu women by Haizi's side were all looking at me passionately. Didn't you notice? Mu Feng's expression changed. Such narcissistic words were not easy to respond to. However, he knew that what the commissioner said was the truth. Perhaps he could disguise himself as a normal merchant, but he was certainly the most attractive of the merchants. I stood on the meadow to attract the attention of the young man hurrying out of the king's tent, Fan Xian said. I wanted him to see me at a glance and then come find me. If it was me who seduced Wei Wucheng to come talk to me, it would not be far from the truth. Mu Feng helplessly spread out his hands and said, so, it's a honey trap. The two of them chatted in the tent. In reality, they were waiting for the sun to shine down on the crescent sea and the arrival of the king's banquet. Before long, a Hu interpreter came forward to respectfully invite the guests. The merchants in the various tents all came out. They did not bring any goods, but looking at their chests, they should be carrying valuable gifts for the chief. Mu Feng also brought some. Fan Xian was not sure of the specific arrangements. He walked at the back of everyone and inconspicuously headed toward the king's tent. The largest tent at the foot of the mountain and the tall royal flag symbolized the noble status and great power of the person inside. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel a strange feeling in his heart. This was the Western Hu King's tent. Inside lived the master of the grasslands. The Qing army and the master of the grasslands had fought and chased for countless years, but they had never been able to find this royal flag. Because the Western Hu King's tent could move at any time and its tracks were mysterious, regardless of whether it was the Qing emperor personally leading an army on a western expedition or the repeated attacks of the great prince and the Yi family, they were unable to find it. They couldn't even get close. Fan Xian's footsteps moved slowly. He thought to himself that the king's tent, which tens of thousands of iron riders could not get close to, was right in front of him. This kind of attraction and temptation was incomparably great. However, he immediately calmed down. The Western Hu King's tent dared to make such a declaration in front of the world. It proved the other party's intentions and the changes the Central Plain people in the king's tent had brought. Only after entering the king's tent did he find that the tent was no longer like a tent. Rather, it was more like a palace with a unique style. The lofty roof was painted with strange patterns. A strange light appeared in the clouds and flowed with strange colors. It immediately gave Fan Xian a strange sense of familiarity. It was like he had seen it somewhere before. His status was the second manager of the leading merchant in Shazhou. Compared to the other major merchants, his status was much lower. He only followed Mu Feng and sat closest to the door. The master of the grasslands, the ruler of the Western Hu, sat in the main seat in the deepest part. It was dark inside the tent. It was impossible to see the chief's face clearly. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and tried his best not to draw attention as he stared in that direction. He could only vaguely make out that it was a middle-aged man in his 30s. Fan Xian found that his calmness was indeed necessary because there were 6 or 7 Hu aces by the Western Hu ruler's side looking down coldly. They were true aces. 3 or 4 of them were even more powerful than Hu Gu. Fan Xian lowered his head and quietly estimated that even if he performed to the best of his abilities, he could at most deal with 4 people. Furthermore, the king of the grasslands, whose face was hidden in the darkness, sat steadily and with the power of a wolf and tiger. It was impossible to tell how powerful he was. To want to capture the Tiger King in the tiger's den was not bravery. It was stupidity. Furthermore, Fan Xian did not have the awareness of being a suicide squad of the Qing army's iron riders. Thus, he lowered his head and nibbled on the leg of lamb. He was silent and listened. It was a pity that there was not much information to remember at the banquet. The mutton was not bad, and the Hu tribe servant girls who poured the wine were filled with a healthy beauty. However, the praises of the merchants and the passionate toasts of the great lords on the left and right were truly annoying to listen to. The king of the grasslands was not as rough as Fan Xian had imagined. After more than 2 hours of banquet, the chief had only said 3 sentences. It was these 3 sentences that made Fan Xian feel a glimmer of coldness. Although his tone was polite, there was a sense of intimidation seeping through it. In the detailed intelligence reports of the Overwatch Council, there were not many records of the chief. For one, the king's tent had always been secretive. For another, due to the continuous attacks of the powerful Qing kingdom and the successive defeats of the Western Hu, the chief's control and influence of the court was far from what it used to be. The reputation of the left and right virtuous kings had gradually grown. When the father of the current chief died, there were even rumors of choosing one of the two virtuous kings to succeed him. Although the chief had inherited the court with great difficulty, the entire grasslands faintly regarded the two virtuous kings as the most powerful. The Qing kingdom's intelligence work had long turned toward the two virtuous kings' tents. They had somewhat overlooked the chief. No one would have thought that the young chief in his early 30s would be able to control the situation on the grasslands so well and begin to greatly weaken the power of the left and right virtuous kings. In particular, he stood his ground against the opinions of the masses and welcomed the Man tribe brothers from the snowy plains in the north. He brought the tens of thousands of Man elites into the personal guards of the court. His power immediately increased explosively. Furthermore, there were so many people from the central plain in the chief's tent. What exactly did he want to do? As Fan Xian drank, he wondered about the chief's thoughts in the darkness. The chief seemed to sense something strange. Furrowing his brows, he raised his head. His eyes revealed a hawk-like gaze as he swept his gaze across the banquet. He didn't discover anything. When his gaze landed on the door, Fan Xian was drunkenly peeking at the bulging chest of the Western Hu girl beside him. With a glimmer of caution and reluctance, he played the role of a merchant's attendant very well. It was still the same old saying. The Qing Emperor and Fan Xian were the two most powerful actors in the world. After the large banquet, countless merchants had been forced to drink by the Hu people. The oil lamps hung high in the tents, giving off wisps of black smoke. The chief and the left and right Gai kings had all gone to rest. Only the two masters and the good men of the Hu tribe remained, relentlessly grabbing the central plain merchants and forcing them to drink. Fan Xian and Mu Feng had long passed out from being drunk. They were carried back to their tents. It was a pity and rejoicing that the Western Hu people's actions were not as preposterous and shameless as the Central Plain people slandered them. At least, in the tents of these Central Plain merchants, there were no seductive Hu women as beautiful as wildflowers. After the lamp went out, Mu Feng sat up with great difficulty. Turning his head, he saw Fan Xian's bright eyes. The gaze was like a wolf's. Involuntarily, his heart froze. In the common house in Qingzhou, Mu Feng had also seen this kind of gaze. It was completely unlike the usual gentleness and coldness of an adult. He didn't know if it was the knife-like autumn wind on the grasslands that made some ruthlessness in Fan Xian's heart resurface. Fan Xian handed over a hangover pill and didn't say anything else. He walked out of the tent. Taking advantage of the cover of the night, he passed through the Hu people's camp and came to the foot of the lonely mountain behind the Crescent Sea. He tied up his clothes and climbed up the mountain. Just as he was about to climb to the top, he found a protruding rock. Sitting on the side of the rock, he took out a small tube from his clothes. Very seriously, he fiddled with it a few times. He then stretched out the small tube and brought it to his right eye. It was the newest telescope produced by the palace treasury. Fan Xian had personally designed it and was the first to use it. Chapter 604. I'm sick. The stomach ache is hard to stop. My body is weak and very uncomfortable. That's all for today. If I can't hold on tomorrow, I will ask everyone for leave. In the black night sky, the multitude of stars was so beautiful it made one's heart palpitate. The faint silver light shone on the crescent sea below the mountain and reflected countless blinking eyes. The grass by the lakeside was soft and the wind was light. It seemed to be talking quietly to people in their dreams. Countless tents spread out from all around the crescent sea toward the depths of the grasslands. Faintly, the lights of the lanterns reflected the stars in the sky. Most of the herdsmen's tents were dark and quiet, bathing in the starlight. Fan Xian's hand holding the cylinder froze slightly. He watched motionlessly at the movement near the king's tent by the crescent sea. It was not until a long time later that he put down the cylinder. Lowering his head and pulling in his knees, he sank deep into thought. The chief of Western who walked into the small tent and did not come out for a long time. There should be aces of the Hu tribe guarding in the darkness all around. However, the entire defense system was much looser than usual. Probably the chief did not want the aces of the court to be too close to the tent. Who lived in that small tent? Fan Xian pressed his dry lips together. His mood was slightly gloomy. Perhaps this discovery was a bit strange, even stranger than Wei Wucheng's coincidental encounter, but Fan Xian did not suspect anything. The Hu people would never imagine that someone could watch everything on the shore of the Crescent Sea from a high and distant mountain. This was not something humans could do. Science and technology were the first productive forces. Fan Xian's fingers gently rubbed the cylinder telescope and he licked his lips. He did not leave. Instead, he waited quietly until the chief walked out of the tent. The 30-year-old chief of Western who wore a thin cloak. He did not have his knife by his side. After he walked out of the tent, he turned his head and bowed slightly. Looking at his expression, it seemed he did not want to leave. A cold and mocking smile appeared at the corner of Fan Xian's lips. After a few days, the large merchant companies in the Central Plain began to haggle with the high officials and nobles of the Western who court about the goods they were bringing. In order to wait for the people rushing over from the two virtuous kings' tents, the time was delayed by 2 more days. The reason why the royal court was showing goodwill to these merchants was naturally to solve the problem of importing resources in the future. However, the autumn sale this time was also a luxury goods trade fair with a large amount of money. The nobles of Xi who had the richest resources on the grasslands. No one knew how much gold and gemstones they had. They didn't even blink when they used them to buy the luxuries of the Central Plain. But even so, it took the merchants from the Central Plains 4 to 5 days to sell all their stock. During these 4 or 5 days, Mu Feng represented the foremost merchant group in Shazhou and was also getting close to the Hu people and earning a little money. After Fan Xian performed his duties simply, he began to walk around the Crescent Sea. Perhaps it was to say that he was looking, or perhaps he was being looked at. It had to be said that given his true identity, such an action in the heart of the Western Hu court was an arrogant and even stupid action. His eyebrows had been pulled closer, and the tip of his eyebrows had been glued up a little. His skin color had changed slightly, but his handsome face remained the same. Thus, when he walked on the meadows and sand dunes near the Crescent Sea, he was always met with countless burning gazes. Although the women of the Hu tribe were not as open as the Central Plain people slandered them, their attitude toward relationships and beautiful men was much more passionate. If Fan Xian could show off the muscles hidden under his clothes, he believed that this kind of passion would be like a fire in autumn and directly swallow him up. However, he didn't want to develop a relationship with the Hu tribe that could never have an ending. He walked around the Crescent Sea and only chatted with Wei Wucheng. Of course, no one knew whether or not he had hidden the thought of attracting another person's attention in his subconscious. The conversation with Wei Wucheng went well. This young man from northern Qi had probably been on the grasslands for a long time. It was rare for him to meet someone as good to talk to as Fan Xian. Occasionally, he would come to talk to him. From their conversation over the past few days, Fan Xian gradually understood some things. However, in the last 2 days, perhaps Wei Wucheng had received some kind of warning, he was more careful with his words. At the same time, Fan Xian found that there were a few more pairs of attentive gazes around him. Fortunately, it did not cause too many problems. The main thoughts of the nobles in the king's tent were still on the merchants and the power they represented. Fan Xian, the pretty boy in the eyes of the Hu people, did not attract much attention. Every night, he would climb the precipitous and lonely mountain on time. Holding a pair of binoculars, he spied on everything by the Crescent Sea. Late at night, the chief did not leave his king's tent every night to go to the small tent. But, the frequency was unusually high. Fan Xian had long investigated. The small tents behind the king's tent were where normal Hu tribe servant girls lived. It was not very strange. What was strange was why the chief wanted to go there. What was strange was that Fan Xian and Mu Feng found that it was very difficult to get close to the small tents. There were many people protecting the small tents in secret, cutting it off from the world by the Crescent Sea. After waiting for 4 consecutive nights, Fan Xian became more and more confident in his deductions. However, he couldn't help but think mockingly that the master of the grassland seemed to be acting a bit too respectful. Chili Chuan. Under the Yin Mountain. The sky was like a dome. It covered the fields. The sky was vast. The fields were boundless. The wind blew the grass to reveal cattle and sheep. Does anyone know where Chili Chuan is? Does the Yin Mountain refer to the mountain behind Haizi? Many of the tents near the court had been withdrawn. The area around the Crescent Sea became empty and quiet. The herdsmen who lived in search of water and grass had their own places to go. Without the goods brought by the merchants from the Central Plains, the leaders of the various tribes led their people back home. To them, the attraction of the royal court was still far less than the goods of the Central Plains. In a quiet tent, Wei Wucheng, who had been a member of the Western Hu Court's palace treasury for a year, held a piece of paper in his hand and asked a companion beside him. These people had already been on the grasslands for a year. They helped the chief handle political affairs and gather intelligence. They had played an important role in the rise of the court. The Qing army's autumn hunt had already ended. The grasslands were preparing to welcome the arrival of winter. There were no major battles to prepare, so Wei Wucheng began to fall back on his old habits. Do you think you're still in Shangjing? Do you think you can still participate in the imperial examinations? One of his companions was clearly not in a good mood. He mockingly said, when you have nothing to do all day, you just hold poems and songs and read them. Do you even know where you are? Wei Wucheng was not angry. He chuckled and said, this poem was given to me by a friend. It describes the scenery of the grasslands very well, so I memorized it. However, I don't understand 2 of the lines. These people carefully savored it and found that it was indeed the case. The words were simple, but they had a grand aura. It was not something a normal person could write. Just like this, the poem, "The sky is boundless and the fields is boundless," began to be remembered. It then spread to the Hu people around the court. It was then translated into the Hu language and sung by the Hu women as they waved their leather whips. It did not spread widely, but rumors were better than binoculars. They were born with wings and were even better than Yi Liuyun's lightness skills. A serving girl carrying a jug of goat milk heard it as she passed by the tent. She stood outside the tent and gently put down the earthen urn. She stared blankly for a while before wiping her milk-stained hands on her clothes. The chief also learned of this poem that night, but he did not pay much attention to it. There were too many things that a mighty ruler needed to consider, and he did not think that this poem could bring about any problems. He was only asked by someone to ask a few questions. When he found out that Wei Wucheng had heard it from the merchants, he did not care. The merchants of the Central Plains had already left the court for 3 days. Would he chase them back just for a small poem? Chief Yu did not care much about this matter, so when he discovered that the servant girl carrying the goat milk urn had suddenly disappeared the next day, he flew into a rage. It was as if someone had dug out an extremely important treasure from his heart. Fortunately, the serving girl had left a letter and advised him not to be impatient. She would be back soon. Only then did the chief stop the idea of sending cavalry to chase after the merchants of the Central Plains. On the grasslands, the autumn grass grew long and covered the roads leading in all directions from the court. Of course, there were no roads on the grasslands to begin with. As the horses trod more, there were naturally roads. In the direction of Qingzhou, a day's journey from the court, there was a large expanse of flat plains. It was incomparably quiet. The autumn sun hung low and was filled with a sense of desolation. The woman dressed in serving girl clothing walked out from the long grass. She then saw the young man across from her. There was a smile on his face, but there was a deep sense of disappointment in his eyes. The young man looked at the woman he had not seen in 3 years. He looked at her face and her eyes that were still as clear as lake water. No, they were even clearer than the crescent sea. He looked at her hands that were stuck to her side and said, "You've tanned." Haitang Duo, who had disappeared for more than 2 years, had now become a common serving girl in the Western Hu court. She gazed at Fan Xian and didn't speak. No one knew what kind of words she was silently saying in her clear eyes. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.